Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the George W. Norris Legislative Chamber. The afternoon session is about to reconvene. Senators, please record your presence. Roll call. Mr. Clerk, please record.
I have a quorum present, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Do you have any items for record?
I have nothing at this time, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Members, we're going to move to the 1:30 item on your agenda. It's on the back page of the agenda. Mr. Clerk.
Mr. President, LB 1073, select file. Senator McKinney, I have enrollment and review amendments pending.
Mr. Wayne, recognized to open on LB. Oh, I apologize. Senator McKinney for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt the E&R amendments to LB 1073.
Members, you heard the motion to adopt the E&R amendments. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say nay. The amendments have been adopted.
I have nothing further on that bill, Mr. President.
Senator McKinney.
Mr. President, I move to advance LB 1073 to E&R for engrossing.
Members, you heard the motion to advance the bill. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The bill is advanced.
Mr. President, pursuant to that action, Speaker Hilgers would ask unanimous consent to expedite Legislative Bill 1073.
Without objection, so ordered. We will move back to the morning agenda where we left off, LB 1011.
Mr. President, I'm sorry, excuse me, Mr. President.
Sorry, Mr. Clerk. Members, those of you who were in the queue, we dropped the queue when we took on that other 1:30 bill, so you'll need to punch in again. Thank you. Mr. Clerk.
Mr. President, discussed this morning pending is floor amendment 74 from Senator Lathrop to the Appropriations Committee standing amendments.
Senator Brewer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was going to stay out of the back and forth on this, but when Senator Blood kind of cracked open the door, I decided I would kind of pick up where we left off. So everybody understands, part of the reason I took an interest in what was happening with the prison is I was on the 127 task force, had a chance to go around and see all of our facilities all over the state. Everything from the facility in McCook, which was, I think, an impressive program they got out there, to the women's prison in York, which I think of all of the facilities is the best run. But when we get to the two primary ones that we're talking about with Tecumseh and Lincoln, what was obvious from the tours and the time we spent there that Tecumseh was poorly built in the fact that, for example, the doors swing instead of slide on a rail with teeth where someone can force open the door relatively easy. Part of what happened with the uprising that they had on Mother's Day. So if you look at those two prisons, they both got problems. Now, I understand the desire to keep the numbers down. And I think somewhere there's a way to address some of those issues. But if we just stop for a second and look at the quality of life and the facilities that we have spent a lot of time, as I said earlier, between the veterans groups that I go out to speak to the Native American groups I go out and spend time with, Bible study, whatever it is out there that I've been a part of. What I've seen is that you can add a new section. You can rehab some of that prison, but think of it as an old Studebaker car. Leaks some oil, runs most of the time. It can get people from A to B, but it's pretty limited. And it's never going to be any better. Now, there's this new Chevy van. It's got air conditioning and lots of nice features. And that's kind of how I'm looking at things now, is we don't have to have a system where we have to do both. We can say, listen, we can't have a new prison because it means that we're going to incarcerate more people. Well, let's just step back for a second and say our prison system has aged or has issues that we can't fix while we got a full prison of people. Now, can we take Lincoln and say, modify it to where it's maybe the lowest risk that we have? Sure, probably could, but we're going to have to do some work to do that. We have nowhere to take everyone. Now, if you have a facility that is designed correctly, and I have not seen the design on the new prison, I don't know if anyone has, and it is set up so that the guards are in a contained area, prisoners can move from spot to spot with a little more ease, if it's got better lighting, if it's got better cafeteria and kitchen, if it's got better commissary, if everything about it makes their life better, I struggle with the idea that we will stay with what we have, because at some point we have to build a new prison. We can't let what we have degrade to the point where their life is miserable. Now, it may not be a whole lot above that now. All the more reason we should look at least for the sake and the quality of life of the people there, that we don't give them no hope for the future. Yeah, I know that's not the view of many, but I think if we just step back from the issues for a second and look at honestly saying, where are we with our prison system? We have to do something. Now, Senator McKinney's going to ask me if I want to build a prison in Gordon. If we took everybody in Sheridan County, we couldn't staff a prison even if we wanted to. And I'm pretty sure my brother that's the sheriff would hang me at high noon for the idea. So I think he's got a valid point that this isn't something everybody wants to have in their backyard. Now, I still think we have to at some point be honest about what is the best for those in prison. And we really do have our limited facilities right now. I remember when Tecumseh was built, it was built with a concept that it was far enough out to where you could come from Lincoln and Omaha. In reality, it's far enough out. Nobody wants to come from Lincoln or Omaha. So, Tecumseh maybe wasn't thought through as well as it should have been. But Lincoln, if you go out there, it is old school prison. Now, they've
That's
done
time.
a lot to
That's time,
improve
Senator
it.
Brewer.
Time?
That's time.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Senator Brewer. Senator McKinney, you recognize it's your third opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Brewer yield to a question?
Senator Brewer, yield, please.
I would.
Thank you, Senator Brewer. I have a question. Not that you kind of answered one of my questions I want to ask, but if we were to vote this year to build a prison, it would take 5+ years to be completed, and we would still have a prison overcrowding crisis. What should we do about that?
Well, we have to take an action. So I think you're on the right course there, because you're right. And again, I'm not sure why it takes 5 years to build a prison, but we're going to use that as a guideline right now. It takes 5 years. We're going to have to figure out a way to sort out who can stay and who can go, because you can't continue to have no more beds available. And your idea of looking at those that are senior, that are of a certain age, something we got to look at, because if they're not a threat to society, I think you've got a good point in that we need to consider whether or not that is something that we should be eating beds and time up with, because they're not going to be a threat to society. And then we're looking at reform in the sense of how do we find penalties that sort those who should be in prison from those who really aren't an issue. And that's the part where I need to know more. I need to figure out what right looks like. And so I'm not going to dive into that. Mine was a real basic question with just quality of life for those that are there.
And I understand that, and I appreciate that. I do believe we should be improving the quality of life for individuals inside. But I think we have to, especially because there are multiple studies that won't be completed until the summer, that we need to really make a sound and justified decision on whether or not we go forward with trying to build a prison. And that's something we need to think about. I know some people think, yes, let's build another prison because NSP is in the state it's in. But I repeat, the department could have done a lot of maintenance over the last, I think, 8 years. Director Frakes has been in that position, but they've elected not to. So I'm not really too sure how much the department actually cares about the people inside, because if they did, they would have began to do something prior to coming to this body and asking us to build another prison. That's something else we should think about. Why did they defer the maintenance for so long and then come to us with a proposal for a $250 million prison or more, which even if we decided to vote to build it, we still have an overcrowding crisis. So I appreciate that Senator Brewer is at least open to having that conversation, because sometimes I feel like it's always no. It's no, no, no. And I'm not saying anyone has to agree with me, but we have to have open dialogue back and forth to come to a decision. If we're a body and we're supposed to work as a team, we all can't be on our different sides of the table and never have a real conversation about the situation based on political views. We cannot play politics with the lives of our taxpayers, the individuals inside and outside. We have to be able to get to the table and actually have real discussions about what do we do about criminal justice reform in the state of Nebraska, because we're currently the worst and we're trending to be even worse. And I don't find that being acceptable. I don't know how you attract anybody to come to our state. I
1
don't,
minute.
I really don't understand. Thank you.
That was 1 minute, Senator.
Well, I'm good. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks, Senator McKinney. Senator Linehan.
Good afternoon. I'm sorry, I got something in my eye. I just have some more questions on the budget, but this is kind of general and I won't take my full 5 minutes. So going through the budget, I know on a lot of the programs that they were increasing the funding with cash funds, and I think this is probably normal. I just don't know. So is there any place in the budget book where we can look and we see how many of the cash funds we're taking to increase spending in other programs? And I just have a question on page 52 at the top, it's lines 1 through 4. It says the Needy Families Program. Did I ask this question already? Maybe I did, but I don't think I get an answer. It's the intent of the legislature to continue to pay child care providers at the 75 percentile in 23-24 and 24-25 using the same federal funding sources. Then a couple pages later, page 54, it's the total amount. Okay, so it's page 54, line 15 and 18, and this is to do with Medicaid, medical assistance. The total amount appropriated for Medicaid nursing facility rates for the program number 348 includes amounts for rate enhancement and any other purpose related to Medicaid nursing facility services, and shall be used, this is the new language, I'm sorry, and shall be used as the base for funding appropriations in 23-24. So I guess my question is that normal that we put in bills? I thought there was something we can't tell future legislators what to do, but this says they shall be used. So I just don't know if that's normal language and why it's in there. And again, the bigger question is, if we're using all these cash funds to do the increases in the rates, it's fine, but does it go into the base, which it means, it looks like it does, so then the base is going to be a lot higher, and are we playing that out? Do we have enough cash funds to keep paying that? Or are we going to have to use general funds? Because I don't know. I know I've worked enough with these numbers on revenue and appropriations that every time you move one number, it moves all the other numbers. So I'm just trying to figure out not just what it does to 22, 23, but what are we doing in the out years with this budget? So thank you. With that, I'll yield my time back to the president.
Thanks, Senator Linehan. I see no other members wishing to speak. Senator Lathrop, you're recognized to close on FA 74.
Thank you, Mr. President and colleagues. I'm going to close on this and then pull the amendment and go on to the next one after I get done speaking and dispense with the vote and the call of the House and all that. But I do want to make a couple of points, and I appreciate Senator Brewer's concern for the state of the penitentiary. I have the Alvine engineering report, and I can see that and frankly, I've visited the pen. They didn't take me down into the mechanical rooms of the place, but I've seen the pictures in the Alvine report. I've read the entire Alvine report, and it is near its end of life. And I think that's hard to argue about. You've certainly heard the governor talk about how it needs to be replaced. But when we come into this body and say, we need to replace the prison, that other stuff we'll get to, we're trying to separate two issues that I think are are absolutely tied together. You can't separate what we're going to do with the population from what we need to build, how much we need to build, where it ought to be built. Those are all questions that are related, because if we do no criminal justice reform, if we make no changes, then the proposal to spend $270 million on a new prison is inadequate. You'll need at least twice that much space. And you'll be talking about $500 million instead of 270. And colleagues, that will just get you to design capacity by 2030. But the problem will continue because the rate at which the average daily population is growing will continue to grow at 2.5%, a couple hundred people a year. And then you're going to be in a situation where you are building 200 beds a year just to keep up. The can has been kicked down the road long enough. And it would be nice if this were not our problem. It would be nice if we could hand this off to the next legislature, but sometimes it's our turn to make the tough decisions. And this is one of those moments. This is one of those subjects. We have a crisis. And for a long time, the crisis was blurred by the crisis with staffing, which was allowed to get so bad that we still have people spending 3 days a week locked down because we don't have sufficient staff, even with the pay raises. And we're still shuttling people into some of the institutions because we don't have enough staff. Might we get to a point where we'll have enough staff? Perhaps. But it's a ways off. It's a ways off. And we're opening more beds, 384 more beds down at the Lincoln Correction Center. We can't staff that. We're short 150 people now. It will require 200 more, and we don't have them. So this conversation about facilities and the conversation about reform have to happen at the same time. Otherwise, we're accepting the notion that we can build 1,500 beds. We don't know which kind we need, and it won't solve the problem. It won't solve the problem. This is not new either. I mean, this has been a long time coming. If you look at that chart, you can see we have been in an overcrowding crisis for longer than the time it was declared. We amended the statute and required the governor to declare the emergency.
1 minute.
And did you say a minute? I haven't seen any sense of urgency to resolve any of the problems that relate to overcrowding. When I introduce the next amendment, I'll begin the conversation on the CJI process. I want to talk to you about why we invited them in, how they came in, what the process was, and then we'll talk about the ideas for our consideration that have come out of that process. And with that, I will ask to pull FA 74.
Thank you, Senator Lathrop. FA 74 has been withdrawn. Before proceeding, items for the record, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Amendments to be printed. Senator Wayne to LB 1011 as well as LB 29, and Senator Erdman to LB 283. Communication from the Speaker referring Legislative Bill 335 to the Reference Committee for referral to the Appropriate Standing Committee. Pursuant to that Reference Committee report referring LR 335 to the Education Committee. That's all I have this time, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Next item, please.
Mr. President, next item, Senator Lathrop will move to amend with floor amendment 75.
Senator Lathrop, recognized to open on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon once again, colleagues. As I've suggested, the problem with overcrowding has been evident for many years. The emergency was declared by the governor July of 2020 because he was mandated to by statute. Our current population is at 152.3% of design capacity, 152% of design capacity. The Diagnostic and Evaluation Center, colleagues, where men go for their first stop on their way to the Department of Corrections, as of the latest data from the Department of Corrections, is at 355% of design capacity. People are sleeping on things they call boats. They call them boats at the, they look like little children's toboggans. They drop them in common areas and sleep on those. OCC, 195%. LCC, 169%. Community Corrections in Omaha, 192%. The WEC Center in McCook, 186% of design capacity. We have an overcrowding issue. And as a consequence of what was obviously an overcrowding issue and attempts that I made last year to pass legislation that were vetoed, I initiated the process of inviting CJI into the state of Nebraska. CJI is the Crime and Justice Institute. They have been in other conservative states. Understand, this idea of criminal justice reform is a conservative movement. It's about the cost of corrections. Ours has gone up 50% in 10 years. We're at $273 million a year from $179 million a year before we build this facility. This is a conservative movement. Senator McAllister read the organizations that support this kind of work. We brought in CJI. I encouraged the governor to participate and the chief justice, and they agreed. And we brought them in because we have a problem. And understand, when we brought in CJI, it's criminal justice reform. And by definition, colleagues, criminal justice reform means instead of being tough on crime, which we've done for a generation as we packed our prisons, being smart on crime. Where do we get the best bang for our buck when it comes to reform and keeping our communities safe? And a lot of states have done this. And it's been a conservative movement because they see the mounting cost of the departments of correction across the country. And while other states who have bought into to criminal justice reform have seen their populations go down, ours is one of 2 states in the country that have watched it go up over the last decade. We're out of step. And we're not spending the taxpayers' dollar wisely. Because at the end of the day, the measure isn't, did somebody spend 19 years or 20 years in prison? The measure is, are we keeping the people of Nebraska safe, safer, or less safe? These reforms that have been enacted in other states have not resulted in increase in criminal activity. And that information is available on the Judiciary Committee website in the form of a report from CJI. It doesn't. That's a talking point, and it's misinformation. They were invited to this state by the governor, the legislative branch, myself, and the speaker, as well as Chief Justice Hebekin. They came to Nebraska and they went through our data. They went through all of our data. They went through probation, parole, corrections, court data, and they told us where the problems are. They told us where our trends are, and they shared that information. And they didn't come with the solution. They didn't come and tell us, you have this problem, here's your solution. Once they spent 2 days presenting the data to the working group of about 15 people, that included 3 senators, 3 members of the judiciary, the governor, some public defender, prosecutor, some law enforcement. That large group broke into 3 different groups, and they each looked at different aspects of the process. Before you get brought into the department, how long you spend there, and what happens on your way out. And they've made recommendations. And the recommendations, some of them you will hear called consensus recommendations, where everybody says, that makes sense to me. And I'm just going to say something about the consensus items, colleagues. They're not the ones that move the needle. I'll go through them all and we can talk about them today. Happy to answer any questions. But where we change the trajectory of our population is in the non-consensus items. They're things that affect sentences, how long somebody spends there. And I want you to know, before we even get into these, that the non-consensus items don't affect mandatory minimums for violent crimes. They don't affect mandatory minimums for gun violence. That, we didn't touch it. We touch a lot of things, and I'll go through them. In my opportunities to speak, I wanted you to know what the process looked like, and I want you to know that it's data-driven. When CJI came in, this isn't speculation. It's not opinion. It's not philosophy. It's not perspective. We got data. And we also had the benefit in CJI when they come in, they also tell you what works and what doesn't. That will make a difference. That won't make a difference. It's data, though. It's data. So when you take somebody who has got a drug problem and you violate them and put them back in prison, do you have a better outcome, or are they more likely to recidivate? Turns out they're more likely to recidivate. Putting them back in prison doesn't help. That's an example of information that they brought with them and was available to the CJI working group. I'd like to start by talking about the first option, and I'll call them options rather than recommendations because it's hard to call something that wasn't a consensus item a full recommendation, but it was a recommendation of the committee that they at least be available for our consideration. And the first one is to establish a streamlined parole process for certain eligible individuals. And so let me explain what that looks like. Nonviolent individuals will be released on their parole eligibility date without a hearing if they meet these two criteria. There is no outstanding residential treatment program requirement and no Class 1 misconducts in the last 24 months. If they qualify, they will meet with the parole officer or the parole board and enter into a contract 2 years before their parole eligibility date. Why are we doing this and what's the advantage? We are doing this to create certainty for the inmate. For a lot of inmates, the parole process feels arbitrary. Should I cooperate? Are they going to let me out? I don't know. If they qualify, by the way, this is a consensus item. If they qualify,
1 minute.
if they qualify, then they enter into a contract. These are people that are nonviolent, people that are 2 years from their parole eligibility date. And the contract basically says, you know what? You don't need any inpatient treatment. And if you don't get any misconducts, you're out in 2 years on your parole eligibility date. What's that do for the institution? What's that do for the inmate? For the institution, it means that that person's going to behave themselves. They're more likely to keep their nose clean while they finish the balance of their sentence and move towards their parole eligibility date. And for the parole board, that means one more small case they don't have to deal with, so they can focus on more high-risk individuals. It frees up time for the parole board. The head of the parole board was on board with this notion, and that is the expedited parole process.
Thank you, Senator Lathrop. Senator McAllister. Senator McAllister.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, colleagues. Next amendment, I'm glad we're moving ahead as we move this afternoon. I always start my talk about criminal justice reform referring to 1980 when there was only 1,400 people in our system. But then we had the 90s. 3 strikes, you're out. Enhanced sentencing. Other factors that built up our prison population to unacceptable levels. And you can use the chart that Senator Lathrop gave us to see how that has increased. We're talking about the CGI work group. And would Senator McKinney yield to a few questions?
Senator McKenna, yield, please.
Sure. Thank you,
Senator
Mr.
McKinney, were you on the CGI work group?
Yes, I was.
What of the 3 branches or the 3 efforts, which one did you serve on?
I was on the sentencing subcommittee.
Well, some of the elements that we talk about in sentencing include consecutive sentences,
Yes.
mandatory minimums. What was the discussion about those 2 particular strategies for criminal justice reform?
With consecutive sentences, we were looking at how there was an increase in judges using their discretion to consecutively sentence individuals. And for the mandatory minimums, we were having discussions about decreasing mandatory minimums for low-level drug offenses.
Were there information provided to show that those particular elements, consecutive sentences and mandatory minimums, don't increase public safety?
Yes, I think, the examples from other states like Utah show that we could do this and be smart as well.
Okay, there was 21 recommendations, is that correct?
Yes,
And how many did the group unanimously adopt?
17.
And what were the 4 others that you chose not to adopt?
The 4 others were geriatric parole for individuals who are incarcerated that are, seniors pretty much, modifying drug possession penalties, discourage the use of mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent felonies, and allow credit to be earned during a mandatory term towards the non-mandatory portion of a sentence. And the 21st one was ensure consecutive sentences are used consistently and appropriately across the state.
We talked about geriatric issues this morning, and I think we discussed the fact that we can actually prove that those people in those senior ages don't recidivate. Is that correct?
Yes, and contrary to popular belief, individuals that serve long-term sentences, especially once they get past a certain age, have a low recidivism rate.
Yes, well, that would be a good strategy for us to adopt. Any clue how many people would be eligible for parole if we were to adopt such a policy?
Oh, that's a good question. I can't say an accurate one off the top of my head, but it would be a good number of people.
I think we made that study last year, and I'm thinking it was easily 60, but it perhaps is number as high as 100 folks in the system right now would be eligible. 1 minute. Thank you. Next question. When it comes to sentencing reform, what were some of the issues that surfaced from those that object to sentencing reform?
There were conversations about public safety, thinking about victims, basically not wanting to be soft on crime. People think they're already doing their job, but they've incarcerated the 10th highest Black incarceration rate in the nation. So those were the conversations.
How about technical violations? If a person had a small technical violation on parole, how often are they sent back to prison?
I think that was 40%.
And I think some states have no longer asked people to go back to prison for a small technical violation. Is that correct?
Yes, and we had discussions about halfway back houses and things like that for individuals.
That's time, Senators.
Thank you, Senator McKinney.
Thank you, Senator McCollum and Senator McKinney. Senator McKinney, next in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. President. But Senator McAllister, we had conversations about, looking at how do we address technical violations and possibly having a halfway back system to not necessarily send those individuals back, but have a system kind of close to how the federal system is, where they have halfway houses and, slowly reintegrate individuals back to society. The CJI process was an interesting process, to say the least. I went into it trying to be as optimistic as possible. But going into it, I clearly stated in the first meeting that, are we here to actually do something, or are we here to pay lip service and say we tried, but we couldn't come to agreement on anything? And in my honest opinion, I was trying to be optimistic, but once we got to actually figuring out what the options were and the recommendations, the true colors were shown. It felt like individuals were willing to go through the process just to say we tried, but not actually willing to take the necessary steps to change our criminal justice system in a state. And that's the problem. Individuals were allowed to express their opinions on the options, or if we want to call them recommendations. Everyone did, and we had our opinions on things. Then once it came time to release those documents, people got hesitant, wanted things to change. It took longer for the final report to come out because of that. And now we have a bunch of amendments on 920 because the process wasn't a good faith process. It was to pay lip service. And you could stand up and say no to this and no to that, but the facts are the facts. We're either going to do something about criminal justice reform in a state of Nebraska, or we're going to continue to have a prison overcrowding crisis, and people could stand up and talk about public safety. But I would just tell you that having a schedule, for instance, of a 4-3 schedule where people are able to roam around inside, for example, Tecumseh from Monday to Thursday, but they're locked up Friday, Saturday, and Sundays for 72 hours. That's not safe. That creates a whole bunch of crises. People have reached out to me about not getting medication, not getting proper medical treatment, being mistreated by the guards, not getting showers when they were supposed to. How's that humane? We have to do something. Again, I will repeat, if we elect to build a prison, it will take a long time for that prison to be built, which means we'll still have a prison overcrowding crisis that we don't address, but a lot of people will walk away happy saying, oh, we decided to build a prison. We are tough on crime in Nebraska. Don't come to Nebraska because we're tough on crime. But people are standing up talking about humanity. How's that humane? And then we, as a nation and as a country and as a body, stand up and talk about other nations across the world about the atrocities and the injustices that they do, but we don't want to hold ourselves accountable. America has been one of the worst places ever in history, from slavery to mass incarceration, but nobody wants to even address that. They want to ban that from schools. People do. It's crazy. It makes no sense. And then you wonder why people want to leave this state, why we can't retain people or anything else like that, because you want to build prisons. You want to stay stuck in the 90s, tough on crime, which, for instance, in North Omaha, being tough on crime hasn't helped. Impoverished my whole life. The crime is what it is because instead of investing in people, we've elected to lock people up, which hasn't helped my community or Senator Wayne's community or Senator Vargas' community at all. But y'all don't care because y'all don't have to live at night and lay in your bed and hear gunshots and hear people get shot around the corner. You don't have to hear the sirens all night. You don't have to wake up and answer those phone calls about who got shot and who didn't get shot. Where was it at? You don't have to hear that. We have to live that. But instead of being smart and investing in communities, you want to build prisons and be tough on crime. And it makes no sense. And somebody please stand up and make it make sense to me. I welcome you to. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator McKinney. So John Kavanaugh. Excuse me, Senator, let me just jump in here for a second. Senator Halloran would like us to recognize 6 fourth graders from the Zion Classical Academy in Hastings, Nebraska. Those students are with us in the North Balcony. Students, please rise. I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska Legislature. Senator John Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor. So I again rise in, I guess, support of FA 75 and opposed to building a new prison, especially without any substantive reform. And I wanted to talk about I had an opportunity, went with Senator McKinney. We went and visited the concerned lifers at the state pen on August 6th of this year. We sat down with them for an hour or so and talked about prison life and talked about, the system and a lot of different things. I know other folks here have had the opportunity to go and visit other institutions and see them and meet with people, but I wrote down a couple of quotes that I thought were relevant and interesting, and I actually asked the guys if I could read them when we were there. So there's one that I think is particularly relevant to this conversation. How you want someone to come out is how you treat them while they're in. That was a gentleman named Todd Cook talking about how we need to make sure that we are making programming available to people. We're not treating people in an inhumane way. A lot of the things that Senator McKinney just talked about, where it's hard for people to feel like a human when they can't get a shower and they can't communicate with their family and they can't get basic necessities. And we treat people, some of these people will be in there for life, the concerned lifers. Not all of those folks will be there for life. Some of them are doing long terms of incarceration and ultimately would get out at some point. But not just them, but everybody that's in. Most of these people are going to come out of the system, and they're going to come back and live in society. Some of them after a year, some of them after 20 years, some of them maybe after 50 years. And we don't focus enough on making sure that people come out better than they went in, better equipped, better prepared, and helping them deal with whatever issue or reason led to their incarceration, and by which I mean decreasing the likelihood that they're going to reoffend, whatever offense, commit another offense. And that is the objective, is to decrease crime, to decrease the number of individuals who are the victims of crime. One of the ways we decrease the number of victims of crime is by decreasing crime, is by making sure that individuals who may potentially commit a crime are not going to commit it for whatever reason. And we do that by helping people with mental health and drug and alcohol treatment. We do that by making sure that people have opportunities. And that is not just building another facility, and it's not focusing on longer sentences and more stacked sentences. So there are ways to work on that and that actually serve the objective that we all agree with, that we all espouse. It's just more complicated. We're taking a lot of time to talk about this, taking opportunity, because it is a complicated issue. It takes time, it takes effort to understand, it takes interest, and we're having this conversation in a longer format for that reason, because the short answer is lock more people up. But that's not the right answer. It's not the constructive answer. It's not a useful answer. The long answer is making these types of changes, systematic changes, institutional changes that will actually serve the state's aims and our goals and be more efficient, cost less, and have a better outcome. The other quote is one that said, "It's about who you are." It's not about what you've done, it's about who you are. And this was a gentleman named Lance Allen who said that a lot of these people, these concerned lifers, did do something terrible, and they express remorse and regret, and yet they're still human beings who are still part of our community, even though they're incarcerated, and they should be treated as an individual and not always, or not treated as the worst thing that they've done. And so it is important in this conversation to remember to reflect upon the fact that we are talking about people's lives. And I know we're not trying to diminish victims of crime, not trying to say that people aren't entitled to justice, but we need to make sure that we are cognizant of the fact that there are humans on both sides of this issue and this situation. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator McAllister. Excuse me, Senator Kavanaugh. Senator Michaela Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor. Good afternoon, colleagues. So this amendment, I think, strikes any changes to the capital improvement project, which I haven't gotten to yet, so I don't know how much that would be, but I'm certainly going to take a look at it and possibly vote for it if we get to a vote on it. I've been going through the budget, as one does, and I really don't have the words for how much I dislike this budget. It reminds me of 1107 in 2020, where we put a whole bunch of things together, too big to fail. Too big to fail is never a good approach. It's not about compromise at that point. It's about forcing everyone to do something that is completely against what they want or believe in because they're going to put something else in there. It's making you decide against doing what you believe is right and doing what you believe is wrong, and putting those things together so that you have to do what's right and wrong at the same time. I don't believe that the canal should have been in this budget. I don't believe that the lake should be in this budget. I don't believe that the prison should be in this budget. If the intention is for this budget to die on the floor, then I understand why those things would be included. They are very controversial. It is a lot of money that helps no one. It does not improve the quality of life for anyone. Yes, it secures water rights in the future, which in the future might yield something. But it is not doing anything for the immediate needs of the people of Nebraska. And if we're not going to do anything for the immediate needs of the people of Nebraska, then I would go back to Senator Linehan's income tax bill and say, well, at least this does something for the people of Nebraska. This bill does some things for some people in Nebraska. It includes reimbursement rates. It adds money to the food bank. It has some money for middle income housing and rural housing, but nothing compared to the things that it could, first of all, do for all of those things, and nothing compared to what we are doing for these other things: the prison, the lake, the canal. The prison, the lake, the canal. Comes down to those three things. You put those in this budget is toxic to me. The prison, the lake, and the canal. I should not be forced to choose between giving people a raise from $12 to $13 who are providing essential services, and then just throwing, in my view, away hundreds of millions of dollars. Because why? Those things should be decided on their own merits. Those things should be their own standalone bills to be debated by this body. The prison, the lake, the canal. And those things are such huge projects that there's so much within them to be debated. Let's take the lake, Jedi, Star Wars, whatever you call it.
1 minute.
Thank you. I don't oppose everything in that bill. There are things in that bill that I think are infrastructure and necessary, but they're being attached to building a recreational lake. And that's forcing the senators who represent those districts where the water infrastructure improvement projects are happening to vote for a recreational lake, even though you don't think we should, even though it will take farmland away from family farmers because we're going to have to use eminent domain. Ask yourselves what you're being asked of to do here today, to do on all of these bills. And is it right? And is it how you want to legislate? Because it's not how I want to legislate. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. Senator Tom Brandt has a very special guest with us today. His mother, Janet Brandt Murray, from Plymouth, Nebraska, is with us in the north balcony. Mrs. Murray, could you please rise? We can welcome you to the Nebraska Legislature. Senator Lathrop.
Thank you, Mr. President. When I last spoke, I was talking about the first option, that having to do with expedited or streamlined parole. That recommendation or that option also included a second aspect, and I'd like to visit with you about that now. Right now, we have about 14 considerations that are taken up by the parole board as they decide whether someone is a suitable candidate for parole, whether they should be paroled or not paroled. The working group that I was in that included the head of the parole board recommended, and it was a consensus item, that we narrow the considerations down to 6. I'm going to read those for you in a second, but I want you to know the rationale behind that. And the rationale is this: when the considerations that have been taken off of the list of considerations are those that are more subjective. And the reason for that is that we want inmates to feel that parole is achievable, something they can do, and have clear guidance for what it takes to get to parole, and not have something that is so subjective that they go, there's no point in even trying. And that's part of the concern that some inmates have, recognized by the parole board themselves, and the recommendations are that we limit or have 6 considerations. I'm going to read those to you so that you know these considerations are fair considerations, they're more objective considerations, and they will benefit both the parole board and those seeking or considering seeking parole itself. The first one is the parole board will consider the following factors. 1, the adequacy of the individual's parole plan, including sufficiency of residence and employment history. Number 2, the individual's prior criminal record, including the nature and circumstances, dates and frequency of previous offenses. 3, the individual's institutional behavior. 4, the individual's previous experience of parole and how recent such experience is or was. Number 5, whether an individual has completed a risk and needs assessment pursuant to Section 83-192. And 6, the perspective of victim or victim's representative on the parole application. That is the first recommendation. That's the logic for the first recommendation or the option. And I'll go on to the second one. The second option that this group developed, and it is a consensus item, is to increase the number of assistant probation officers, they call them APOs, in the state, and pairing those individuals with probation officers who manage high-risk caseloads to ensure that officers are able to follow evidence-based practices and to ultimately maintain and improve high success rates of probation supervision. It will first be a pilot in one county or probation district in order to assess the impact of increasing the number of supportive personnel within the probation workforce. Why is that important? Some time ago, I think it was in 605, we established post-release supervision. They are followed by, so some people with lower level felonies, when they are discharged, they will have post-release supervision, in addition to those that just have straight up probation. And what we've seen with post-release supervision is now probation is dealing with some higher risk individuals, people that need a little more attention, people who need a little more oversight. By establishing assistant probation officers, it allows our probation officers to focus on the high-risk, high-need individual. It gives them help without having to hire an actual trained probation officer. This will help our probation officers cover more ground, cover more cases, and be able to do a more effective job focusing on the high-risk, high-need person. It is a good idea, and for that reason, it was a consensus idea in the work group. I'm out of time.
13 seconds.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Lathrop. Senator Walls.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've been really trying to take some time today to read this report from the Nebraska Criminal Justice Reinvestment Working Group, and I don't know if you all have copies of this. And if you don't, I would suggest that you get it because it has some really great information about just about the process and the recommendations. I honestly have to say I appreciate the conversations that we've had so far about the process and the recommendations that were made, the options that were made in this report. I am not an expert. I'm not an expert in this area. And that's why I rely heavily on Senator Lathrop, Senator Pansing Brooks, Senator DeBoer, Senator Wayne, Senator McKinney, and many other people to talk about the findings. And I rely on them to help me understand what the recommendations are and why they're important. I'm kind of disappointed that there are so few senators on the floor right now. This is an important issue. Adding prisons without reform is a waste of taxpayer money. And unless we address the root of the problem, we're going to continue to just throw money away. More important, this really is a waste of a life for a person who has the capacity to succeed and really add value to their communities if they're given a chance. So I'm going to continue to listen. I really appreciate the conversation. I appreciate the information, and I would like to yield the rest of my time to Senator Lathrop.
Thanks, Senator Walls. 3 minutes, Senator Lathrop.
Did you say three?
3.
Thank you, Mr. President. The third option for our consideration coming out of the CJI process is generally establish supportive housing programs for individuals on supervision in the community, specifically developing a supportive housing program to provide accountability and intensive support to individuals on parole who commit technical violations without revoking them fully back to prison. Let me tell you what this is about. So when we place somebody on parole, they are accountable to a parole officer, right? They have to check in, they have to maintain employment, they have to have a suitable housing, and they also have to take drug tests. And sometimes people on parole will be late checking in, they might have a dirty UA, not a law violation, they haven't been caught committing another felony. We're talking about technical violations. This is a consensus item, I believe it is, because recognizing, and those who were involved in this process recognize that sometimes people trip up, but they don't need to go back to prison. 40%, this is Senator McKinney just answered this question, 40% of parole revocations are the result of technical violations. So do we send them back to prison where they will then take a bed, or do we find a place, I like to call it a halfway back house, right? Somewhere, parole is establishing a pilot program. Senator McDonald and I have worked on a larger program than that, but in the short term, we'll have 15 beds in a facility that will be established by parole. Here's what it does. If somebody is just completely ignoring the parole officer and doing nothing they're supposed to, back they go.
1 minute.
But if somebody's late checking in, they're supposed to call on Monday and they call on Tuesday. If they just need a little more structure to succeed, this is what they would go to. It's a great idea. Senator McDonald and I saw this over in Council Bluffs when we toured a facility over there where they take people who will succeed, but they need a little more structure. And it's, okay, you're going back to the halfway back house. Ross Cotton calls it the prep house. I think that's offensive to some guys that went to prep. Maybe John Kavanaugh. That would be about it. It is a really thoughtful, a good idea. It may well help to have some of our technical violations on parole spared the expense of going back, expense for us of having them back at the Department of Corrections. And
That's
that
time,
is
Senator.
option number 3. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Lathrop. Senator Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor. I appreciate a little Omaha humor with the Creighton prep joke. I'm really going to miss Senator Lathrop in this body, and I've known that, and we've talked about that, but listening to him discuss this bill at length this morning and throughout yesterday, I've learned so much from him about how the criminal justice system in Nebraska actually works, different terms that he uses that I didn't know, and it just gives me a lot more clarity to the process that I think is a value add that we will really be losing in this body. I also appreciate what he was talking about, the halfway back houses for people who just need a little bit more structure. Colleagues, if I were ever incarcerated and I got to come out on parole or probation, which by the grace of God, I haven't been basically, I mean, I make mistakes like everybody does. And a lot of times I think that the reason people end up incarcerated or not is just a matter of luck. But I'm the kind of person who needs a lot of structure in my life. And I think if I were on parole and I had to check in at a certain time, at a certain place, at a certain date, and I couldn't go outside a certain boundary, that's something I would frankly have a lot of trouble with, and probably a lot of people in this body too. I'm thinking specifically of one constituent of mine who I corresponded with when he was incarcerated many years ago. And when he came out, he came back to live with his wife and his family in my district. And he kindly actually offered to campaign for me and knock doors for me. And he became an important resource to me, understanding what it's like to be incarcerated and understanding what it's like inside the prison system, because he kindly shared that experience with me. And he is now incarcerated again on one of those technical violations. I think that he told me he went to Vala's pumpkin patch with his family, and that was technically outside the boundary of the area he was allowed to go. And now he is back in the correctional facility in Lincoln. So colleagues, how is that keeping anyone in Nebraska safer? I mean, we've got someone who's trying to become civically engaged, who wants to reintegrate into his community, who's spending time with his family doing really wholesome, positive things. And our reaction to that is to send him back to prison. So when we talk about examples of overpopulation in Nebraska and that we're putting people in prison who don't really need to be there. And so that's why we need to look at these criminal justice reforms that Senator Lathrop and Senator McKinney have been talking about, that we heard through CJI, that we've heard through different consultants we need. But then I hear the governor, or I hear certain folks in this body say, but we can't do that because we're going to be soft on crime. The crimes, quote unquote, that we're talking about in many of these cases is just like what my constituent did. The technical violation of going outside your parole boundary by taking your kids to the pumpkin patch for Halloween. I mean, that's the level of the reality of the experience that we're talking about. And I think that there's just some misunderstanding about what being soft on crime really is, because when you're reincarcerating these people who are not a danger to society or to anybody or to themselves or to their families, that's not making society safer. It's not doing anything for public safety, and it's probably worse, harder on crime, or I don't know what. It's probably making us less safe if we keep antagonizing and harassing these citizens, these neighbors that we have in Nebraska who are trying to do the right thing. I participated in the ACLU ALEC.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor. I participated in the ACLU ALEC seminar and discussion that was facilitated by Senator McAllister in December 2020 that he spoke about. And that was another really great opportunity. I know several of us were there. A lot of colleagues showed up to that one. And I was listening to it in the car, actually. I was driving my child. We were going to the Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado. So, you know, mid-pandemic, like we're going on our little vacation road trip, driving across Nebraska to Colorado. And it was a really great environment to listen to that conversation because it was easy to focus on listening. And then I had my child with me in the car and they were listening too. And then it was easy to have a conversation, a discussion in the car about criminal justice reform, about incarceration in Nebraska, and then hearing all of these solutions from both sides of the political divide
Yes, Tyson.
about, thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor.
Thanks, Senator Hunt. Senator Wayne.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm not going to get on the prison discussion. I think we've been saying that a lot. But what I did pass out to colleagues is a chart that I kind of spent doing time yesterday when and the day before, and we were drafting our amendment to 1024, while we're justifying a cash transfer of $225 million. And if you look at waters and trails, and that's everywhere outside of Omaha and Lincoln, really, but we'll just talk waters and trails. We're going to spend in special projects, according to these budget adjustments, $318 million and $550,000. Rural specifically special projects, we're going to spend about $105 million in the budget. We talk about military and military bases. That includes our Nebraska, not our Nebraska Air Force, but our Nebraska National Guard. We're spending about $60 million, a little bit over, almost $61 million. Then when you get down to prison reentry, you'll notice we have a $4.3 million adjustment, and that'll keep going for the next couple of years. That was part of the $13 million prison contingency fund we had last year. But then when you get to what's actually happening inside of Omaha and Lincoln, it's only $20 million. I just feel like I heard the speaker say when we talk about ARPA funds, they want it to be balanced throughout congressional districts. That's what I want our special projects through our budget to look like. What I didn't include is our overall salary increases. I didn't include YRTC 15 million because I believe the YRTC serves kids from all over the state. I didn't include the 15% adjustments for most of our providers because they serve everybody across the state. If we want to get technical, there's probably more in Omaha and Lincoln because there's more people, but it's based off of people, not necessarily a special project. But I find it interesting when you add them all up. When you add them all up, we're looking at roughly a little over, let me get the right number here. Technology is always great. So outside of Omaha and Lincoln, the actual city limits, we're looking at over $484 million of what we would deem special projects. And I think, and I'm not discounting, there's probably one in here, two maybe I'm discounting, I think we should have a conversation about, but I'm not really opposed to any of those. But for hypothetical reasons, let's say you think a lake between Omaha and Lincoln is somehow strictly going to benefit Omaha and Lincoln, we can include that in the number. We can also include the National Guard readiness in Bellevue. What I won't include is STRATCOM because not everybody can go there. So even if you subtract those out, we're looking at over $393 million of special projects outside of Omaha and Lincoln. That's why I'm having a hard time supporting the budget. I can talk about the prisons, but I feel like you guys are hearing enough about that, or you should probably keep listening because there's going to be more information you should hear about. But just from an overall math perspective, looking at numbers for numbers, Omaha and Lincoln proportionately, based off of the budget adjustments, aren't involved in the conversation for special projects. I don't know if you want to call them special projects, but that's what they are. So we have $484 million, roughly out of the $700 million, according to the budget adjustment report, $725 million, that are going to special projects outside of Omaha, Lincoln. And then you wonder why I'm saying, if you say you support North Omaha, show me in the budget. And what I'm not going to let happen on the ARPA conversation, so I'm foreshadowing this right now.
1 minute.
You don't get away and say you're investing in North Omaha with federal dollars. I'm asking the state to step up now. The state should step up just as much as what we're doing with federal dollars. You don't get to say we got a pot of money from the feds and now we're investing in North Omaha. That's no longer good enough, Appropriations Committee. It's no longer good enough to this body for me. We have to put state dollars in. And so on Amendment 1024 that I filed yesterday, we're going to ask for a $225 million cash transfer to balance out this, what I think is not equal or not equitable, whatever word you want to use because it qualifies for both, budget that we're laying out before us today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thanks, Senator Wayne. Senator McCollister.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon again, colleagues. I've talked a lot about my time at the Platt Institute, and my job as executive director there was to hire PhDs that would write about policy and give us a direction to go. And one of those papers we wrote was with the Texas Policy Organization, Right on Crime. And apparently we finished that report in 2011, maybe 2012, but we really didn't take that advice, and that's unfortunate. Why do I say that? Nebraska is only one of 4 states that experienced increased incarceration rates since 2010. Nationally, the number of incarcerated citizens under state or federal jurisdiction across all states and territories declined by 11% between 2009 and 2019, while Nebraska's population continued to increase. In addition to pushing capacity of states' prisons to their limits, Nebraska's rising population is occupying a sizable portion of the state's budget. Corrections expenditures have increased over 51% since 2011, from $179 million to $272 million in 2020, not including the additional, at that time, only $130 million, but now it's approximately $272 million, estimated to cover the cost of a new prison. Nebraska is hardly alone in this regard. Since the early 1970s, state prison populations across the country expanded rapidly, and the state officials have spent an increasing share of taxpayer dollars to keep pace with soaring prison costs. From the 1980s to the mid-2000s, spending on corrections was the second highest growing budget item in state budgets. We have talked about opportunity costs. And if you spend increasing amounts of money on prisons, that reduces the amount of money you can spend on North Omaha, South Omaha, lowering income tax rates, property tax reform. That's not possible if we're continuing to spend extra money on prisons. What are some of the key findings that we should talk about? The length of stay for incarcerated individuals in NDCS has increased 38% in the last decade, driven largely by increasing sentence lengths and decreasing parole rates. And that's been a problem. I think the decrease in parole rates has occurred just in the last decade. And maybe it's we're afraid to let people out. I don't know what the problem is, but we need to deal with that issue. And I'm hoping when LB 920 comes up, we can deal with that issue. Another key finding: these trends come at great cost to the state, with corrections expenditures growing over 50% since 2011 to more than $270 million in 2020. Yet, in spite of this investment, recidivism rates have increased over time, with 30% of those released in 2018 returning to NDCS custody, up 4 points since 2008. Perhaps it's the issue that Senator Patty Panjing-Brooks claimed, where those people that jam out are more likely to return. That's something we need to deal with. The training we need to give those people needs to occur before they jam out. So these are some of the issues we need to deal with. Nebraska is an outlier. We need to make the trip that many other states have made. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator McCollister. Senator McKinney.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise again in support of FA 75 because I just don't think we should be setting aside any money for a prison. But to more so continue the conversation, so we have the First Step Act, which was passed in Congress and signed into law by President Trump, and then we have LB 920. They have some similarities. So, one, limit use of consecutive sentences. In the First Step Act, which was passed, it reduced mandatory consecutive sentences for multiple firearm convictions by eliminating a stacking provision, which previously resulted in a 25-year mandatory minimum. In LB 920, it attempts to limit the use of discretionary consecutive sentences to cases in which aggravating factors are present. Would Senator Merman yield to a question?
Senator Merman, yield, please.
Yes.
Senator Merman, I'll read this again. So we're on the topic of limiting the use of consecutive sentences. In the First Step Act, it reduced mandatory consecutive sentences for multiple firearm convictions by eliminating a stacking provision, which previously resulted in a 25-year mandatory minimum. LB 920, which Senator Lathrop introduced, attempts to limit the use of discretionary sentences to cases in which aggravating factors are present. Which one goes further in your opinion? The one in the First Step Act or the one in LB 920?
Could you repeat that one more time?
All right. So in the First Step Act, it reduced mandatory consecutive sentences for multiple firearm convictions by eliminating a stacking provision, which previously resulted in a 25-year mandatory minimum. In LB 920, it attempts to limit the use of discretionary consecutive sentences to cases in which aggravating factors are present.
Well, I do believe the judge should have a discretion.
That's understandable. Do you think what was done in the First Step Act went further than 920?
I'm still not quite following the language in the two examples, but I do believe the judge should have discretion on sentencing.
Okay, thank you. Senator, you're right. Senator Clements, would you yield to a question?
Senator Clements, yield, please.
Yes.
I'm not sure if you've been listening to the conversation. So we're on a topic of limiting the use of consecutive sentences. In the First Step Act, which was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Trump, it reduced mandatory consecutive sentences for multiple firearm convictions by eliminating a stacking provision, which previously resulted in a 25-year mandatory minimum. In LB 920, which Senator Lathrop introduced, it attempts to limit the use of discretionary consecutive sentences to cases in which aggravating factors are present. Which one you think goes further?
Which one goes further?
Which one do you think, what's the word? I guess I asked, which one could you live with?
I'm comfortable with the state statutes that we have now.
All right, thank you. And I'm asking these questions because I think, we need to understand what's, on the plate for us as a state. We had a bill passed in Congress that I believe went further than what LB 920 is doing. And we can't keep the status quo in Nebraska because that has led to the 10th highest Black incarceration rate, the worst prison overcrowding crisis in the country, and a lot of other things. So if you haven't, I'll send this around to you guys so you guys can look at it and kind of get a better understanding of what I'm trying to ask. But thank you.
Thank you, Senator McKinney. Senator John Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor. Well, first, I want to just address, I had circulated a a pin and like a little flyer from the Irish American State Legislators Caucus. And being that tomorrow is St. Patrick's Day, I know there's a party that some people are going to this evening. I just thought if anybody needed some sort of Irish paraphernalia to wear to the party, I wanted to make sure you all got it a day early so you could wear it tomorrow and tonight. But that is from our friends in Ireland and interest, I suppose, of continued friendship with the United States and recognition of, I think it's 100 years of Irish independence this year. So that's what that is. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk about it off the mic. So I wanted to kind of just reiterate what Senator Lathrop was talking about in terms of some of these recommendations and go back to the one I think he just talked about his most recent time on the mic is establishing supportive housing programs for individuals on supervision in the community, which I think is option 3 in the CGI report. And I previously talked about the recidivism, the number of people going back and from the report, the quarterly jail census, prison census report that includes the number of people coming back for technical violations. And in the months of October and November, as I noted, they were more than 50% technical violations. In the month of December, it was close to 50-50. If you look at the recommendations, if you look at the CGI report, the basis of the recommendation says, while statewide prison admissions are decreasing for new admittance, meaning new people going into prison for a sentence, having just been sentenced by a judge, that number is going down. They are increasing for individuals returning to the prison for parole revocation. Admissions to NDCS, Nebraska Department of Correction Services, due to parole violations have increased from 2011 to 2020, and 1 in 6 admissions to NDCS come from either parole or PRS failures. And so the reason that this is important is one of the things leading to our problem, our crisis, our overcrowding, is the fact that we are having people serve their sentence, get paroled, get into the community, and then they have a violation, a technical violation in more than 50% of those instances, and then being sent back to custody. That's a problem on both ends, right? That's a problem in terms of the crowding issue, because we are housing more people, but it's also a problem from that humanitarian aspect of these individuals have served their sentence up to and completed the programming that we asked them to complete in custody to qualify for parole, gotten on parole, and started a life, which is what we want them to do. And then they've had, as Senator Lathrop pointed out, the technical violations can include being late, having a positive UA, which means testing positive for drugs, which people I know are quick to say, yes, using controlled substances is illegal. It's against the law in the state of Nebraska currently. It would be a violation of your terms of release, and it is not a good idea on top of that. However, a lot of people, when they get out, they're obviously living in a new environment, which is, we all are quick to say is certainly better than being in prison, but it is different than what you become used to in that period of time. So they're adjusting. They're trying to find their place in that world outside, where they're trying to find a job, trying to get a place to live, try to reconnect with their family, which was difficult because we charge people to make phone calls and to write emails when they're in prison. So we're disconnecting people from their communities. And so they get back out and they have some kind of problem that they are not equipped to deal with, and they revert to the thing they know, which can be a substance, and then they have a positive test, and we send them back to prison for that. That is not serving the long-term aims of getting people back into a productive life for them. It's not serving the long-term aims of decreasing number of people in custody. It's not serving the long-term aim of decreasing crime. It is not serving any of our objectives. It is costing us more money. So creating supportive housing is helping people solve one of those problems that they face as they come back out and as they try to reintegrate into society. And that is why it's a good recommendation. That's why it's in the program here, and that's why it will help in one way. There are many other recommendations that we can keep talking about, but that is one small thing we can do to help alleviate the crowding crisis we have, help people achieve the objective that we set out for them and that we are trying to accomplish as a whole, as a state. And I'll push my light, talk about the next one. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. Senator Michaela Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor. Good afternoon, colleagues. Okay, continuing on with the budget. So there's a lot of those following along at home. There's a lot of this is happening over 8 hours, but also really quickly. So we are working on a massive budget, the largest budget the state has ever done. And we have the whole fiscal office basically sitting over the side over here. And the Appropriations Committee and the Fiscal Office have been working on this all year. They get the bills out. They worked on it over the weekend, and we start debating it immediately. So when you see us all reading here, it's because this is basically our time to really dig into the budget and ask questions. And asking questions, I think, is really important. So I'm just figuring out what these three different pieces are. So the piece that we talked about yesterday, LB 1012, that was creating new cash funds for different projects that we have going on. The bill that we have in front of us today is the actual appropriating language for those various projects. And then the next bill up is the directing the transfer of the funds by the treasurer to those cash funds. So these are working in a series, and at each point, there's a lot of overlap as to what's in these. And it, in some ways, gives us an opportunity at every stage to talk about whether or not this is how we want to spend this money. The canal is in all three of these bills. JEDI is in all three of these bills. The prison is actually in two of these bills because we don't have appropriating language. So it's not in the current bill, but it is in the final bill where we send the money, where we transfer the money, where the money moves from us to that fund. So each step of this is important. Each step has a reason. But this one right here that we are debating, and I will say yesterday, I found it very refreshing. The conversation and the debate around LB 1012, it was the first time in a long time that I felt like the entire body was engaged around the conversation, which was great. There was real questions back and forth happening. And that's great. We were creating new cash funds. But today we are talking about the actual appropriation of the budget. And the chamber has been not very full. And there's been pretty much the same people talking. There's a lot in this bill. You don't have to just talk about prisons. Some of us, that's what we're talking about. That's what we care. Criminal justice reform, sentencing reform, not spending money on people, not prisons. But this is really, really important. And I personally feel like 8 hours isn't enough to be debating over $1 billion and how we're going to spend it. And I would really encourage colleagues for you to start getting in the conversation. Because if you're not getting in the conversation, then what are you doing here? This is the only thing that we have to do. We are constitutionally required to do this. Everything else we are not required to do, but this we are required to do. So I would really just encourage everyone to, even if you don't want to talk, just engage in the conversation on the floor. People did this yesterday, and I feel like it was productive. 1 minute. Okay, well, probably less than 1 minute now. So there's a lot more in this budget that I want to talk about, so I won't even get started now. I will take another turn. Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor.
Thanks, Senator Kavanaugh. Senator Ben Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor. First of all, I just want to actually praise Senator Lathrop for his drive and his passion for prison reform. Over the last 4 years, I know he's been a champion of that, and he's always been trying to move the needle in a certain direction. And so with that, I just have a couple of questions that Senator Lathrop would yield, please.
Senator Lathrop, yield, please.
I'd be happy to.
I appreciate a lot of the information you've been giving me off the mic, and I think that's helping answer a lot of my questions. But I think one of the questions that I had, several times you've mentioned this, that there have been many states around the nation that have reduced or changed their sentencing laws. How many of them, if you know, how many of them have also had an end-of-life prison like we do?
A what prison?
An end-of-life prison. I think we kind of use that.
Oh,
that
I
was-
think Utah went through that. My recollection is that CJI made that in the presentation of information to the broader group of senators. I think they talked about their experience in Utah.
Okay.
Where Utah was looking at kind of the same place we're at. Do we build more? How much more do we build? Should we do reform first, which they did?
Okay. I just want to make sure we kind of differentiate the different states that might have an actual functioning prison that's maybe more modern versus one that we're kind of in between a rock and a hard place where we really do have to replace our prison that we have now, because according to the report, they even said it's an end-of-life prison. And the people that I've talked to said it's like, the age of everything in the prison is making things difficult and even unsafe for many of the employees. One of the things that we did also discuss, and you did answer it, I believe, was Utah, from my understanding, when they reformed their sentencing laws back in 2015, 2016, did see a drop somewhere around, I think, 18% in prison population, which makes sense. However, what they did see a significant increase was the amount of parole or probation violations, because there's a lot more people on probation now. They saw a huge increase in parole violations, which then led to an increase in incarceration rates. I know that's something maybe you can address. You have some information, and I asked you about that, so I can give you some time later to address that if you want, or if you want.
Okay.
Okay.
I'd be happy to, because
Yes,
I do have information.
Thanks. And also, I am not completely opposed to sentencing reform for non-violent crimes. I know it might seem a little bit out of the realm of my colleagues or my political philosophy. However, I think that when it comes to Nebraska, I think that needs to be also in conjunction with building a new jail. I think we need a new jail, a new prison. Washington County recently just built a new jail. They had to increase, I can't remember exactly the amount of beds that they have, but they pretty much tripled the amount of beds that they had. And I got a chance to tour that facility, and I was just amazed on the technological change they had from the new prison. They had this big command control center in the middle where they could view everything. The facilities were much better. From my understanding, employee satisfaction rose quite a bit. They felt more safe. Healthcare options were different. The ability to have programming and expanded education with this new facility was improved. And so when we talk about we need to improve programming, we need to improve, we need to decrease the amount of people going into prison. I think first I think with a new prison, we will address a lot of these problems.
1 minute.
When we can build a new prison, when we can have better facilities to have better programming. I think one of the things we always mention also is that we can't get employees to work here. I think if we build a new facility, we might be surprised. First of all, they're going to feel more safe, because from my understanding, that's one of the main reasons why they leave. It's not how much we pay them, but actually how unsafe they feel. And so with a new facility, I think we will address one of those major concerns, and the employee retention will go higher, along with pay. But also, I think the life or the lifestyle of the prisoner will also dramatically increase, helping with positivity, helping with reform, helping with education. So maybe we won't see the recidivism rate we have now. So I think, which came first, the chicken or the egg? I think the jail, in my opinion, should come first, also perhaps in conjunction with looking at some
That's time,
possible
Senator.
reforms of nonviolent crimes.
That's time, Senator.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Mr.
Senator
Senator.
Hansen. Senator Lathrop.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm glad Senator Hansen went immediately before me, because I'd like to respond to his concerns, thoughts, questions. Utah, that was looking at a very similar situation. Their data suggested that in 2015, their crime rates were actually going up relative to the national average. And they were in the predicament that we find ourselves in. Do we build? What do we build? What's it look like? Utah took a thoughtful approach and said, let's get the criminal justice reform piece put in place, and then we'll know what to build and how much to build and what it needs to look like. I can tell you, I'm not opposed to new facilities, better facilities for the incarcerated as well as the people that work there. It doesn't change the fact that the population is still growing. Nevertheless, Utah's experience was that after they instituted reforms, their crime rate decreased by 26%, while its arrest rates decreased by 19%, and its imprisonment rates reduced by 4%. So they didn't experience a problem relative to public safety as a consequence of making those kind of reforms. That said, colleagues, I want to go on to the fourth option from the CJI process, and that is to have the Administrative Office of the Courts and Probation develop internal guidance. So this is not necessarily a part of 920, but something that would happen independent of that. Establish guidance and training for probation officers across the state regarding the use of early discharge policies and the criteria which must be met by the individual on probation prior to the officer's submission of early discharge, as well as the key components to include in the early discharge summary report. So here's what happens. Research indicates individuals can reduce their sentence or their supervision by, if we provide incentives for positive behavior, that can result in the supervision of individuals that are at higher risk. Under state law, probation officer is authorized to submit an application for early discharge at any time during supervision and required to submit it when the individual on probation is in compliance with all conditions, not had a major violation in 6 months, and is at a reduced risk of recidivating, and has served 3/4 of the imposed sentence. So what this option is intended to address are those individuals who are well behaved, they're eligible to be discharged early from probation, but across the state, and you can see on page 27 of the report, across the state, people getting off of probation early varies from county to county. There needs to be more consistency in that process. This would be an internal guideline established by the Office of Probation to incentivize people to get off probation sooner by being compliant, allowing the probation officer to focus on the higher need, higher risk population. The fifth option from the CJI process relates to 2 individual sections, but broadly speaking, it's to narrow the broad sentence ranges by tailoring punishment to specific levels of seriousness. And specifically, that relates to burglary and low-level theft.
1 minute.
This consensus item would create degrees of conduct within the burglary statute to differentiate levels of conduct, severity, and harm by separating the types of burglary based on the building types. For instance, separating a home invasion, which would be the highest level of burglary, from a non-residential or a commercial structure. We're one of the very few states that don't grade burglary according to the type of structure which has been entered during the burglary. That is a consensus item, actually. And the second one, briefly, is you can get a felony conviction if you shoplift at a misdemeanor level twice. One of the recommendations is simply to say, modify the habitual theft statute to avoid lengthy incarceration for low-level conduct by establishing the theft of any amount.
That's time. Thank you, Senator Lathrop. Senator Pansy Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor. I stand up to just add a little bit more to the conversation, then I'm going to give some time to Senator Lathrop since he's asked me for it. I just want to point out that the JFA study shows that recent growth in the Nebraska Department of Correctional Services has risen 4.4% for admissions between 2018 and 2019, with 15% decrease in parole releases. If we cannot do a better job on parole and getting people the programming that they need so that they can become safer to be able to come out in our communities, and I guess we're just doing what we're going to do. Continue paying for prisons and do nothing else to solve the problem. We continue to pay for these prisons and we do nothing to solve the issues. Texas does. I guess they're better legislators than we are. I just don't understand why Texas is closing prisons and we want to continue to build them. It's against the national trend. It's against what makes good business sense. And now I'd like to give the rest of my time, Mr. Lieutenant Governor, to Senator Lathrop.
Thank you, Senator Pansy Brooks. Senator Lathrop, 3 minutes 30.
Thank you, colleagues. I'm going to jump ahead because option number 6 is going to require 5 minutes, and I don't want to try to do that one too quickly. Let me talk about number 7, and the next time I'm on the mic, I'll talk about number 6. In number 7, a consensus item, is to increase the education for stakeholders about young adults involved in the criminal justice system. So we all are familiar with the fact that there are juveniles. Those are the people that are not yet 19. And those individuals, depending upon their crime, they have an entire process available to them in the juvenile court. But what science has taught us is that young people, their brain is not fully developed till they're 25 years old or right around there. And why is that important in the criminal justice context? Because we call them emerging adults. They are, many of them actually, adults. And if you look at statistics on who commits the most crime at what age, you're going to see the bell curve at its peak at about 19 or 20. In other words, that's where most of the offenders, the age of most of the offenders, and it goes down to sort of a normal level after about 30. Why is that important? Because when we're trying to fashion punishment, when we're trying to develop problem-solving courts, it's important to recognize that people in that emerging adult class, they're going to do things that are impulsive, and they're going to do things that are yielding to peer pressure. We certainly see that even with serious crime. We see it take place with all sorts of crime. This option merely requires that people be educated on that fact and take it into a consideration as we fashion policy as well as sentence some of these more youthful offenders. How much time do I have?
1 minute 15.
Okay. Number 8 is expand problem-solving courts. And I'll start on this, but this one may require a little more time as well. It's important for you to appreciate, I believe, option number 8 is expand problem-solving courts. This is very much a goal. It doesn't require, well, it does, but it is a goal. It's something we hope to do. It's problem-solving courts, as many of you know, are a tremendous success. We take high-risk, high-needs individuals and place them into a problem-solving court, which is a type of probation, if you will, where they are accountable to the court. A judge will see them on a regular basis. They have a caseworker that makes sure that they are getting the treatment they receive, staying sober, maintaining their employment, and doing the things that many of them have gotten off track from. It is a very positive thing. When we talk about problem-solving courts, it is broad enough to include veterans courts, emerging adult courts, drug courts. We even have a pilot program
That's time,
for
Senator.
mental health courts. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lathrop. Senator Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor. On my last time speaking, I was talking about the seminar with the ACLU and ALEC that was organized by Senator McAllister that I participated in. And I want to share some things that were discussed by the facilitators. I won't read the whole thing, but I wanted to I say that this is from the facilitators so people don't think this is my own words or something, but one of the things they say is, so what's the path forward for our most overcrowded prison system in the nation? Any meaningful effort to reach a 50% reduction in incarceration in Nebraska must include a concerted effort by lawmakers to stop introducing or endorsing any legislation to create new chargeable criminal offenses, particularly legislation that duplicates or overlaps with existing offenses. Lawmakers should also move to correct or repeal existing laws that dictate unduly long sentences, such as mandatory minimums. Reducing the amount of time served, even by a few months, could significantly reduce the state's prison population. Further, a focus on front-end reforms that reduce the number of people who come into contact with the correctional system in the first place is essential. Pre- and post-booking diversion programs should be expanded in an effort to direct people out of the criminal legal system, particularly those who may benefit from access to treatment and support for people with disabilities. To address the booming probation and parole population, Nebraska policymakers can look to California, where reducing the parole conditions for lower-risk people has proven successful and saved the state money. I'll interject here and say there are other states besides California that have done this. If some of you are allergic to the word California, don't get too hung up on that. Were Nebraska to adopt the reforms outlined in this blueprint and achieve a 50% reduction in its prison population, the state could save nearly $140 million by 2025. Money that could be spent on schools, infrastructure, and services for citizens, or simply given back to taxpayers in the form of tax breaks. Adding prisons to Nebraska without any criminal justice reform is going to end up being a waste of money. And the reason we're taking time talking about that on this bill is because efforts of leaders in this body to make a deal for a new prison or for renovations to prisons that we have or any kind of capital construction related to incarceration. Many people have said, I'll support the new prison, I'll support appropriating money for that type of endeavor if others agree to criminal justice reforms. It's kind of a negotiation and a trade-off that we're trying to do, and we're not there. And that's a really frustrating thing because what am I supposed to conclude? What is anybody supposed to conclude when you hear one side saying, we want to build a new prison, but we don't want to do anything to reduce the prison population so that in a few years from now, when we finish this new prison that we've appropriated funds for, we have to build another one. Okay, well then that puts the state in a new problem, in a new position that creates a new problem of not having enough money, ongoing flow of revenue into Nebraska to keep making a new prison every 3 to 5 years. I think that to people who are advocating for this, colleagues, that is the goal. They want to keep having to build new prison all the time because then that opens up Nebraska to finally having private prisons in the state, which we don't have private prisons in Nebraska right now. But if we keep having the demand of needing to lock people up because we're not doing any criminal justice reform, then that's going to open the door, 5-10 years from now for future legislatures to say, maybe it's time for us to finally start contracting with private prisons. And this is something that can definitely directly benefit politicians. To me, this is a completely calculated and strategic political move to support private prisons that then can come back and support politicians in their efforts to gain wealth and power. So when we say that we're going to have to keep building prisons down the line, I think that that's by design, colleagues. I don't think that's an accident. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Hunt. Senator Morfeld.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I have not spoken this afternoon as an actively practicing attorney on this topic. And so I thought I would speak up a little bit. So first off, I've been on the Judiciary Committee for the last 8 years. And when I came in 2015, a lot of work had been done already on LB 605, or what would become LB 605. So as a freshman senator, I came in and about a year or two of work had been done in terms of looking at what are we going to do to responsibly create some policies that would stop the tide, particularly of nonviolent offenders going into our prison system, and being able to do that in a responsible way that keeps our communities safe. Now, in order to get LB 605 across the finish line, and I was not an integral part of this because I was a freshman senator and just trying to figure out where the restrooms in my office was. But at the time, a lot of legislative leaders that were leading the charge on that had to make a lot of concessions in order to get LB 605 across the finish line. And those concessions, quite frankly, many of those concessions, quite frankly, were things that allowed the state to continue down the path that it had already been headed. And the experts at that time said, hey, listen, like, you can make these amendments to get it across the finish line, but these are some pretty serious gaps and holes that are going to lead to continued overcrowding. And here we are, 7 years later, and some of those things that were identified then were identified again as some of the root causes. And the bottom line is that this responsibility is ours to set the policy and set the standards across the state. And we cannot rely upon, I shouldn't say we can't rely upon, but in the end, this responsibility sits with us. The county attorneys and law enforcement prosecute and enforce the law based on the laws that we have on the books, and they have the discretion to do so. Now, we can disagree with their discretion. I often do in some cases, and I've been fairly vocal about that in a different role, in a different capacity. But in the end, we have to take the leadership. And we have to set the standard. Because otherwise, depending on who the county attorney is, depending on who the law enforcement officer is, they are going to use their discretion. And in some cases, that discretion, particularly for nonviolent crimes, leads to over-incarceration of people that could, one, have accountability, but two, have that accountability in a setting that is more conducive and more productive, not only for them, but also our community and our society. And so this is up to us. And I can tell you one thing that isn't going to work is us not doing anything, because that's been pretty much the case over the last 7 years. And now we have literally the most overcrowded prison system in the entire country. And we're not going to be able to build our way out of this problem, because we have a more fundamental and root cause of the problem in our policy and in our laws. So we have to do something. The other thing that we have to address is the accessibility of mental health access, and then also community corrections as well.
1 minute.
We have to be able to provide more resources for community corrections. We have got to provide more access to mental health supports. Because I tell you what, a lot of the crimes and a lot of the issues that we are facing are substance abuse related, that are often the root cause is mental health issues. And people are self-medicating. They're self-medicating because they still don't have access to healthcare. They don't have access to mental health supports. And in some cases, we've had prosecutors come down to the Judiciary Committee and tell us that the only way to get somebody help was to prosecute them, which is not what they wanted to do. But that was the only way to get that individual help. And colleagues, if we don't take away anything in this body on criminal justice reform, it should be that one thing that when you have prosecutors coming down to the Judiciary Committee and the Education Committee in some cases saying the only way that I could get somebody help and keep my community safe was to prosecute them, even though I don't think I should, and it's not just, we've got a problem.
That's time.
We have to take action. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thanks, Senator Marfeld. Senator McKinney, it's your third opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I rise in support of FA 75, but also would say that I had one of the pages pass this out to each one of you. It's the First Step Act compared to LB 920. Again, the First Step Act was passed in Congress and signed into law by President Trump. Secondly, I was sitting there thinking, I was like, what if the pandemic didn't happen and there weren't any ARPA funds? Would the state be willing to invest into North Omaha? And I'm just wondering, would the state be willing to? So would Senator Wayne yield to a question?
Senator Wayne, would you yield, please?
Yes.
Senator Wayne, if there weren't any ARPA funds, as of now, do you think our state would be willing to invest into North Omaha?
Based off of the current budget before us and based off of history, very little investment, I believe.
There's currently $175 million set aside, not expended, but set aside for a prison. What could you do with that $175 million?
Well, we could start an airport project that would allow businesses, at least 5 businesses who have publicly committed to coming down to North Omaha and creating around 400 jobs that are livable wages, high-paying jobs. The average salary is around $65,000 a year. We could do at least 20 to 40 million in affordable housing. We know we currently have a backlog of about 5,000 affordable homes, approximately 1,000 affordable unit apartment complexes. So that's just right there. We can come up with 175 off of those 2 projects alone that would fundamentally transform North Omaha. And if you take it from a mathematical perspective, if we're able to reduce those 4 census tracts plus the other 12 census tracts that have 16% higher more of African-American males in the judicial system, that would pay for itself by the reduction in recidivism, because studies show if you have a living wage job and you come out of incarceration, or you're already going through the system, if you have a living wage job, it actually reduces your incarceration rate and recidivism rate around about 27%. So that's about $5 million a year you could save. So just off of housing people. So mathematically, the 175 million would pay for itself within about 15 years.
So are you saying investing in people and not prisons would be a better solution for our state?
Not just for our state, but for some of the hardest hit communities. But absolutely, if you just look at the math, that's why I said earlier, conservatives shouldn't support this budget. If you just look at the math on the prison alone, the math doesn't make sense.
I agree with you. I do not think it's fiscally responsible to continue to put proposals for prisons on the table and not invest in communities that have been the hardest hit for decades upon decades.
I agree with you, Senator McKinney. How many times have we do most of our meetings in North Omaha, and there is a need and a want to do better and be better. We're just looking for the state to level the playing field.
I agree with you. It shouldn't just be the federal government that's willing to address these inequities. I think the state of Nebraska has responsibility in itself to invest substantial amount of dollars into our communities and other impoverished communities across the state.
I agree with you. I got a phone call that maybe my district might be a potential site for a prison. That's not the way I want to bring jobs to North Omaha. And that's why I relayed to Director Frakes and everybody else. We need good paying jobs that don't necessarily involve the system. But why you brought that up, Senator McKinney, if we just had an extra 1,000 community beds in Omaha, there are enough employers right now who could take those individuals and they could work making $25 an hour at manufacturing facilities in both of our districts. Like Logiers is looking for 3rd shift operators and warehouse people every day. So we have them. We have over 1,000 people right now listed as community corrections who are sitting in prison instead of out in the community serving the rest of their time.
And I think that needs to change because I get many calls about people being classified as community, but they're stuck in Tecumseh in maximum security. And we're talking about humanity and the mental well-being of these individuals. Just imagine being classified to be in community, working yourself back in the community, but the state wants to keep you in a maximum security facility that is on a 4-3 schedule. And for 3 days out the week, you can't leave your cell and you barely
That's
get
time,
medical
Senator.
attention. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator McKinney. Senator John Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Mr. President. That was a good conversation. And so I wanted to kind of circle back to conversation I heard some people talking about earlier about the reducing the jam out releases, which is the option 6. And I know several people have talked about this. And I heard Senator Moorfeld talking about LB 605, which was the last kind of big reform we undertook. And one of the reasons, so in LB 605, the legislature reduced sentences under class 4, 3A, and 3 felonies, and also put made those a mandatory straight sentence, which is you only give somebody one determinate number of years. So on a class 4, it's 0 to 2 years. So you would give somebody a 2-year sentence. They do that sentence. After they do that 2-year sentence, then they would be placed on post-release supervision, which is essentially parole, although administered by the probation office. And so that's how those worked and the idea was that having people on a period of community supervision after a term of incarceration decreases recidivism. And what the legislature at that time failed to do was to reinstitute a rule that had previously been in place where the top number and the bottom number needed to be different. At that, originally, I think it was a 20% number, which meant that the top number sentence could be the maximum, and then the bottom number, meaning the parole eligibility number, could be no more than 20% of what the top number was. The reason for that is that the difference between the top number and the bottom number is the time in which an individual is eligible for parole, but not eligible for full release, meaning not jamming out. And that period of time that the person spends in that window, they could still spend it in custody. So if a judge gives somebody a 10 to 20, they have that 10-year window, which with good time is, again, the 5-year window. But they have that whole time in which they could potentially be paroled and be on community-based supervision and be subjected to that supervision and services as kind of a step-down level of supervision from in custody to out of custody supervision in the community. And that helps with reducing recidivism by making sure that people have that kind of step-down supervision, which then, of course, makes sure that they're continuing to follow the programs. And so that's the reason for that, the difference in the top number, bottom number suggestion in the report, as it says,
Maybe they get parole, maybe they don't. And it's really important to know two things. 95% of these people are coming back to our communities. 95% of them. And having them come out on parole is far superior. And when we get to those things that are more contentious, which is where it gets politically difficult, if the sound bites and the rhetoric are all about being tough on crime, then that's when you start to get nervous about this. I get the idea, but I can't get there. But now it's up to us. It's our turn to solve one of our problems. And by the way, this stuff is being led by conservatives who realize, did you say time?
That's time. Thanks, Senator Lathrop. Senator Pansy Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor. Well, I've decided to just find this comical now because I've brought the 1/3 rule to get rid of these determinate sentences every biennium since I got into this legislature. I've been trying to talk you all into understanding that these flat sentences, and you may be confused by the words determinate and indeterminate, but it's just what it sounds like. A determinate sentence is a determined sentence, such as 12 to 12 years or 10 to 12 years. So an indeterminate sentence is something that with a broader intersection of time, like 5 to 15 years. So what's happening is that we're getting mad at these people and we're going to throw the book at them. And so what happens is we give these determinate sentences. And the judge decides, yeah, we're just going to throw the book at them. The county attorneys want to throw the book at them. And we're going to make darn sure they stay in as long as they can. Well, guess what happens? So they don't get the programming. So even if it were 10 to 12 years, they would theoretically be eligible for parole at half of that time. So that's 5 to 6 years. Well, the problem with an inmate who's paroling is that they are subject to supervision. And guess what? They don't want to be subject to supervision. They want to get out and be free of the whole system, not have anybody checking in on them, not have anybody trying to tell them to check in and give urine samples or whatever is necessary. So we've been talking about this since 2015. And we're all of a sudden talking, oh, well, gosh, we should think about doing either the 1/3 rule or the 1/2 rule. And that 1/2 rule says that the sentence cannot be, the minimum cannot be greater than 1/2 of the sentence. So if the sentence allows somebody to be put away for 12 years, then the minimum cannot be greater than half of that. So that means the sentence is 6 to 12 years. At that point, we know that with good time, if the inmate's acting appropriately, they get to come up for parole at half of that time. So that would be, if it was a 6 to 12 year sentence, that would be 3 to 6 years. Now, that doesn't mean that the inmate's going to be let out in 3 years, but it does mean that he or she can come before the parole board at that time. And so the issue is the person goes before the parole board and the parole board says, there is no way in heck that we are going to let you out now, which is reasonable because what? Why isn't it that they're not letting them out? Yes, because they've not had the programming. So they have not had the programming required. And so of course they're not going to be let out. They haven't followed through the issues. But of course, we aren't providing all the programming that they need. So we are part of the problem. It's interesting because they're in the JFA report. There's a part about this, and it says the Nebraska justice system has a multi-pronged sentencing structure comprised of both flat, determinate, and indeterminate sentences. A determinate sentence sets a fixed term of incarceration without an opportunity for parole. So again, it's a determinate sentence. If a person with a determinate sentence loses any good time, the entire sentence will be extended. An indeterminate sentence includes a maximum term to be used to compute a defender's discharge date and a minimum term to be used to compute the defendant's parole eligibility date. Again, with parole eligibility, there's much greater chance of not jamming out. The most infamous jam out was Nico Jenkins, who jammed out straight from solitary confinement, threatened that he was going to kill people, and he did. So we are our own worst enemies here. We're not only costing the state millions of extra dollars, but we're also our own worst enemies because we are not making the state safer by these laws. It was an indeterminate sentence includes a maximum term used to compute a defendant's discharge date and a minimum term to use to compute the defendant's parole eligibility date. In 72, the Nebraska Legislature. Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Senator Pansy Brooks. Senator McCollum, you recognize. This is your third opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, colleagues. On my previous times on the mic, we talked about the parole system. And one of the problems we have with the parole system is that the number of people receiving parole has dropped. I'm not exactly sure why that's occurred the last 4 or 5 years, but it has dropped. Maybe Senator McKinney has an answer or can give me some rationale for that. Senator McKinney, will you yield?
Senator McKinney, would you yield?
Sure. Senator McAllister, to respond to that, I would say there's probably a multitude of issues. I think we need to rethink the functioning activities of our parole board, but also it was brought to my attention earlier this week or last week that the parole board has only met 50% of the time as a full body. A handful, like last year, like they've only met as a full body 50% of the time. The other times there's either at least one person gone 50% of the time. And when you look at the numbers, there's a decrease in parole, however you said, for people being allowed on parole when there's less than a full body.
Are they required to have everyone in attendance in order to conduct a meeting?
I wish they did. I don't know for a fact, but I think we need to look at that.
Let's change our focus a little bit and talk about probation. And some states offer those people coming out of the correction system less time on probation than others. In fact, I think Nebraska is it an obligation to set probation at 5 years? Is that correct? Or some states, and I guess a certain number of states have allow no more than 2 years on probation because they've found that there's diminishing returns with the longer terms of probation.
I would agree with that. I believe the longer someone stays on probation, the more likely that they're going to reoffend just by nature of life happening. And when you think about technical violations or something like that, you've on probation for 3 years and you miss a meeting and you go back to prison, but you've been out and you haven't done anything for 3 years, they send you back. You go to Vallis Pumpkin Patch on accident because after 3 years, you may forget, maybe I can't cross into Sarpy County. But you go back to prison, you've established a life, you got a livable wage job, you're taking care of your family, but you get violated and sent back.
One other issue is we've been talking about technical issues with probation. And some states limit incarceration for technical probations to no more than 30 days. But I don't believe Nebraska has a policy. Are you aware of a policy with technical violations in Nebraska?
I'm not aware, but I think that would be a smart policy, and I don't think you should be sent back.
Yeah, last question. Some states allow for a driver's license suspension for failure to pay fines or fees. Does that occur in Nebraska where you can get your driver's license revoked?
Oh, yes, you can. If you fail to pay a fine or a fee, if you have back child support, they take your license, which I think is dumb. If you want somebody to pay child support, why would you take away their ability?
Thank you,
don't-
Senator McKinney. I yield the balance of my time to Senator Pansing Brooks.
Senator Pansing Brooks, 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator McAllister. So just to finish my really exciting story and description of determinate sentences, the CFA report says on page 5, in 1972, the Nebraska Legislature mandated indeterminate sentencing by operation of law. The indeterminate sentencing was mandated by operation of law under a statute that year. And if a judge attempted to impose an indeterminate sentence, a statutory minimum sentence was automatically used in contravention of what the court had decided to determine the inmate's parole eligibility. We attempted to do this same kind of work, but after LB 605, when CSG came in 2014, it was recommended to get rid of our determinate sentencing, to go back to what we were doing, and we still have the same problem. That it has been recommended by study after study after study. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thanks, Senator Pansing Brooks, Senator McKinney, and Senator McAllister. Senator Hunt, you're recognized. This is your third opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, adding a new prison without adding any reforms to our criminal justice system is going to end up being a waste of money. And it's not a fix, because in a few years, the incarcerated population that we have in Nebraska is going to continue to outgrow the space that we have for them. And I want us to ask ourselves if this isn't a little bit by design. I think that there are a lot of people who are interested in bringing private prisons into Nebraska, and people are very strategic long-term. And so I think making sure that we can house our own prison population is going to be imperative if we want to stop something like that from happening. And we cannot do that unless we can also reduce the people that we have going into our system. There is a web of a huge network and list of ways that we can do that, whether that's through improving educational opportunities or improving food security, reducing poverty, having more jobs that people can do, reducing the qualifications that we have for certain state jobs. I just saw this news that I thought was really great just a moment ago that said Governor Larry Hogan, who's in Maryland, today he announced the launch of a multi-pronged first-in-the-nation workforce development initiative to formally eliminate the four-year college degree requirement from thousands of state jobs. That's the kind of thing that we know could keep a lot of people from reoffending, and also, you know, making sure that people who have backgrounds can get jobs like that. And these are all part of the huge web of solutions that have been brought to us by different experts in criminal justice reform that opponents have completely rejected, but we can turn on the spigot and have a seemingly endless amount of money reoccurring to keep building new prisons. And I don't think that that's a conservative approach to government. And it's going to continue to erode the public services that we have in the state that are already eroded. I don't think it's that super different from the movement we see to privatize education. You know, we have needs in our public schools, we're not funding them. We have needs in our carceral system that we're not funding. And eventually, we're going to have people in state leadership who say we need to start looking at private solutions for that. In education, you know, that's school choice and school vouchers and charter schools and tax credits for private schools and things like that. And in incarceration, that's going to be private prisons. The three biggest businesses that government is in is medication, incarceration, and education. And these are things, you know, healthcare and public safety and education that are in the basic best interest of every single Nebraskan. And I want to make sure that it's always public funds that are supporting those institutions and not private dollars potentially, where we don't know where that funding is coming from. They aren't accountable to the public. There's no oversight from government. You know, I'm certainly not one of those people who is saying government is the answer to things. But what I will say is that public oversight is always something that improves any government system. So the more public oversight we can have in our carceral system, That's going to come when it's funded with public dollars. And that's something that I want to keep secure in our state, and something that I think we need to do more of with our healthcare system and our education system as well. But in this legislature, our habit of setting aside really large sums of money for things that are not certain yet, for things that we haven't completed the study on, for things that we don't know the feasibility about yet, that's a big problem. We have to stop rubber stamping things that are not set in stone, especially just because I think we've got a lot of money kind of burning a hole in our pocket. We've got our governor going out. We have many leaders in this body here who are trying to build a legacy and leave something behind before their term limited. And I think a lot of people are kind of going on a shopping spree. And this isn't responsible. It's not being good stewards of public tax money when we keep rubber stamping things that are not set in stone. The governor will be gone. Scott Frakes will eventually be gone. Many of us will be gone, and we will be worse off than when we started. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Hunt. Senator Dorn, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And a little bit of the conversations have at least been going on lately. I want to thank some of the people for getting up and talking about, I guess, jamming out and parole. I'm going to yield my time here to Senator Lathrop, but I'd like him to talk a little bit specifically about has COVID or how has the work staff or all those things affected parole, and that ultimately leads to, you know, more people jamming out and stuff. If you could visit with that a little bit, why are the reasons we're having not so many people qualify for parole?
Senator Lathrop, 4 minutes, 24.
Thank you for that question, Senator Dorn. So you had a COVID piece in there. COVID affected, my understanding is COVID affected the ability of the parole board to get 5 members there at any given time. You need 3 affirmative votes to get parole. And when a parole board arrives and 2 members can't make it for whatever COVID-related reasons, then that effectively means you need a unanimous decision from the 3 people that showed up. I know that we had complaints coming from some of the people who were before the parole board, and they said, when there's only 3 people there, any one person can veto or stop a parole from happening. We have 5 members for a reason, because we asked the parole board to manage risk, right? If we wanted to have 0 risk tolerance, we would put a parole board in place that always says no, right? We'd fill up our prisons and no one would get parole. We have to rely upon the parole board, and these are the governor's appointees approved by this legislature. We have to rely on them to use their judgment, to look in the file, to talk to the offender or the inmate, to determine, is this person a suitable risk? There is always risk, because we're dealing with a population that have demonstrated their ability to commit felonies, or they wouldn't be before the parole board. But their job in our process is to manage that risk, try to reduce the risk as much as they can, not unlike Director Frakes' responsibility with community corrections. If he sends somebody over to community corrections, that guy can be on work release, or that inmate can be on work release, and Director Frakes is managing risk. We're always managing risk when it comes to the Department of Corrections, parole, and probation. And we rely on them to do assessments. They have standardized assessments that help them, inform them of the ability. Parole board's also going to look at how you behaved when you were in there. Have you been on parole before and then we had to violate you because you wouldn't talk to your parole officer, or you absconded and we had to drag you back here from Colorado? You're probably not going to get parole, or you're going to be in there a while before you do. So that's a really important function. And when we, in the Judiciary Committee, when we are approving a candidate for the parole board, we have that conversation. You understand that you are responsible for managing the risk, keeping society safe, but that doesn't mean nobody gets parole. It means you're trying to decide who are the best candidates. And do we have people that violate parole? Yeah, we do. We have a good number of them who will have some kind of a violation. 40% of them are technical violations. A lot of them are another felony. Back they go. They get another charge, and they get a violation of parole and they're back at the Department of Corrections. So I have great respect for the parole officers, the parole board, and the work they
1
do.
minute.
But it's really important to understand that they are managing parole. The effect of COVID, I can only tell you sort of secondhand what I've had people say, that sometimes they weren't at a full complement, and that became an issue because it's harder to get 3 votes when there's only 3 people or 4 people there versus 5. And if you get someone who's particularly risk adverse, then if they're typically a no, then you gotta rely on the others to give you the 3 affirmative votes to get you across the finish line. They are also reviewing violators to determine what's the appropriate sanction. So they're a busy group of people doing a lot of hard work and trying to manage the risk and keeping in mind that public safety is their North Star, but that we can't keep people in there until they all jam out.
That's time, Senator. Thank you, Senator Lathrop and Senator Dorn. Senator Matt Hansen, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was inclined to encourage to turn on my mic by the story Senator Lathrop earlier was talking about jam outs. And I think the concept of jam outs is very much something we as Nebraska have to continue to work on and continue to solve. And I'm going to talk about kind of my limited experience working on this particular issue, and then I'll yield my time to Senator Lathrop if he wants it later. But the concept about jam outs, and as Senator Lathrop describes, is in many circumstances, it's literally an individual who has served every day of their sentence in the state pen, the state correctional institution, and has literally completed 100% of their sentence. They've served up until the last day, which means, of course, that regardless of that day, regardless of that is, they are let out. So in addition to the obviously lack of supervision, the lack of any sort of supervision post-release, as well as transition to the community, it also leads to some absurdities occasionally, including with the gate check that has been mentioned. I worked on this issue trying to, ultimately in a bill we passed several years ago, allowing individuals to have an opportunity to get a state ID before they leave prison. And I'm going to talk about that for 2 reasons why that's important. One is the jam out date can fall on any particular day. And I had a person who was working at a nonprofit talk to me about somebody who jammed out on Thanksgiving morning. That was just what happened to be the very last day of their sentence. And they were let out of prison on Thanksgiving morning, didn't have anywhere to go, and most places were shut down. And so they had to have somebody from the nonprofit. Luckily, this person had planned ahead and looked up their phone number and called them collect from a payphone outside the prison to come pick them up. And that is what happens when people jam out. Like, they're just literally let out the door. In addition to the complication and why this nonprofit cared, was when you are released with the gate check, it's difficult to even cash the check because you don't necessarily have an ID, let alone a bank account. And of course, you have to pay money to get the ID, but all of your money is in this gate check, which has this catch-22 of how do you get a driver's license, how do you cash a check, back and forth. Department of Corrections, I understood, started working with the issuing bank of the checks that they will at least have a recently released inmate license, and that one particular bank would use that as proof of identity to cash the check. But again, that was still an individual who had to know that, figure that out, and get themselves to that bank in order to get those funds. And again, this is usually just for $100 or slightly more. That might be all of the kind of startup money they have in the world to reestablish their life. So what happens then is, of course, there are nonprofits that work in this area, including we had a nonprofit here in Lincoln that was working on issues related to providing and making sure that persons experiencing homelessness had access to identification. Basically helping people who were homeless get state IDs. Well, what they were finding is once that kind of program got up and running, is that a lot of the people that they were helping were people who were almost immediately recent releases from some of the state institutions here in Lincoln, primarily the state penitentiary. So we were literally releasing people. They were jamming out. They were getting a check they couldn't cash. with no plans and where to stay, where to go. And they were often walking across town to one nonprofit they had heard about. And that nonprofit was then helping them front the money to go apply for a state ID and then taking them to the bank where they could go cash the check. And that was a service we were relying upon both the individual jamming out of the correction institution to figure out and a local nonprofit
1 minute.
to really pick up the slack. And that's the situation where just the logistical issues of the jam out. I'm not talking about even all the recidivism measures or supervision or all the other benefits. Those are just some of the issues that we in the state have let happen as we've neglected kind of our post and or post-release of correction system by encouraging and allowing so many jam outs. It is just kind of an absurd thing of people standing outside on Thanksgiving morning making a collect call to hope somebody from a nonprofit will call and pick them up and take them somewhere. Like that's the situation we're leaving people leaving the state pen from. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Hansen. Senator Moorfeld, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I want to kind of start where I left off there. I think that it's important to start grounding ourselves back into some of the summary takeaways of CJI's analysis. And I know that it's been discussed a few times by Senator Lathrop and some others, but I pulled up some of the summary takeaways because I wanted to sink in just a little bit more if we can. Nebraska's prison population has grown 21% over the past decade. This growth is largely due to increases in the length of stay due to longer sentences and a decreasing percentage of parole grants, which was discussed by Senator McKinney and a few others. It'd be nice if the parole board show up to work every once in a while. Through admissions, though admissions have declined, the majority of admissions are still for nonviolent, low-level offenses. Though the admissions have declined, the majority of admissions are still for nonviolent, low-level offenses. Despite a 50% increase in the corrections budget, prisons are over capacity and recidivism rates are growing. So that should be a clear sign that what we're doing up until this point isn't working, and we need to make changes. Further, it's not on this summary slide because I was just pulling up the slides from CJI that I had on my phone, but crime rates are actually down. Crime rates are down overall as a state. And yet our prison population is going up because we have longer sentences, particularly for nonviolent crimes. Or we're filling the prisons with folks who committed nonviolent crimes who have been proven in other states and in other places to be more successful with accountability. So there's still accountability, but through community corrections and through rehabilitation and providing other types of services. This not only keeps our community safer because they're able to provide for themselves, they're able to get the help that they need, but it also ensures that there is accountability. So these community corrections programs, and if you've gone to any of the drug court graduations or the veterans court graduations, and you hear all of the requirements in order to pass that, it's pretty incredible. So these aren't programs where, you know, there's accountability, quote, accountability, and then they don't show up, or nobody knows where they're at, or whatever the case may be. These are really intensive programs that are, quite frankly, tough for people to pass, particularly people with substance abuse problems. And we all know somebody in our lives that has dealt with a substance abuse problem, and it's generally not solved the first, second, or third time, because it's a disease that leads people to doing things that are against the law and crimes, and there must be accountability. But we also must acknowledge the fact that these are folks that oftentimes need help, and if we don't get them the help they need, they go into the prison, and then they come out worse than when they went in the first place. Because 99% of the people that go into our criminal justice system are coming back out and are going to be grocery shopping right next to you, going to be at your parks, going to be with you at your workplace. there should be a strong incentive to make sure that they have the supports and resources to be successful if they go into the system, that they're more successful when they come back out, which quite frankly is rarely, if not ever, happening right now in our current system. When you're this over capacity, people are rarely ever coming out better than they went back in, than they went in. And oftentimes they're going back in. So colleagues, we need to do something different. What we are doing is statistically not working. It's making our communities actually less safe because it's increasing recidivism. And we have to take a different approach. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thanks, Senator Moorfeld. Senator Blood, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Fellow Senators, friends all, I stand currently in support of the floor amendment, but also in support of the amendment and the underlying bill. With that, I would ask if Senator Lathrop would be willing to yield.
Senator Lathrop, would you yield?
I would be happy to.
Thank you, Senator Lathrop. Senator Lathrop, are you willing to go down memory lane with me right now?
Sounds like it.
All right. I thought we needed to stir things up here. Everybody's getting sleepy. So do you remember in 2013, and these aren't trick questions, so I'm going to try and guide you as best I can. Did inmates sue the state of Nebraska over prison overcrowding? Do you remember?
I know that inmates filed suit against the department for the circumstances of their confinement.
Do you remember off the top of your head, and I have the answer if you don't, in November 2014, what the percentage of our capacity was, over capacity?
I think we were at 150.
159%.
Okay.
So that previous June, we were at 151%. Do you remember what 140% triggers with our executive branch?
Well, the statute, and I have a copy of it here, says that the governor may declare an overcrowding emergency at 140%. We did amend that, I think, in 2015 to say if you are not below 140%, an emergency shall be declared July of 2020, and that was done, and we remain in that emergency.
And a federal judge can also do that, is that correct? Or not?
A federal judge did not do that. That
But
was all
they said
statutory.
that they can they?
If a federal judge and the case against the state was dismissed, in fact, claims against those types of claims that are filed in federal court aren't just we're overcrowded, judge orders something. It really is those things that you don't get because you're overcrowded. So I'm not getting sufficient medical care, sufficient dental care, ADA compliant. Those things that are symptoms of the overcrowding are the basis for the lawsuit. And in this case, the inmates attempted to turn it into a class action. That was denied, and the case was resolved one way or the other and dismissed shortly after that.
But a symptom of what was going on.
Pardon me?
But a symptom of what was going on, unhappy with the
Yes.
overcrowding, taking it upon themselves to try and create change. And during that time, and I just want to make it clear again, if we were to look at the flow chart of state government, where in the flow chart does the prison system fall? Who's out of the three branches, who's responsible for the prison system?
The executive branch is responsible for running the Department of Corrections.
All right, thank you for that. So at that time, would you say that it was accurate that you and Senator Ashford and a few others who actually sat on that committee, that you had Senator Heineman come, I think it was in December 2014, that you continually preached at that time that justice reinvestment was mandatory at that time?
So in 2014, we had a special investigative committee that looked into the miscalculation of sentences in addition to some Nico Jenkins stuff. And what became clear when we did the special investigative committee is a lot of the scandals that were associated with the Department of Corrections at the time were a function of the executive branch attempting to resolve overcrowding through what became known as the no-cost options, which is paroling people that probably weren't good candidates, developing a furlough program that didn't go through the Administrative Procedures Act. And then they just started having people leave with an ankle monitor and finish their sentence on their couch.
And is that when the Anderson decision started being discussed more?
My recollection is Anderson was, what do we do with the people whose sentence were miscalculated and they are out? I'm not going to be able to tell you the specifics of that, other than we had the Castilla decision that decided the proper calculation of good time. That wasn't applied by the department. A bunch of people got out, and then we didn't bring very many of those people back, very few of them.
All right. Thank you for helping us go back to when much of this started.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lathrop and Senator Blood. Mr. Clerk for items.
Thank you, Mr. President. Amendments to be printed. Senator Bostar to LB 800, Senator Lanahan to LB 939, Senator Friesen to LB 1012. Your Committee on Judiciary, chaired by Senator Lathrop, reports Legislative Bill 920, 922, and 1213 to general file, all three having committee amendments. Senator Holland introduces Legislative Resolution 341. That'll be laid over. That's all I have this time, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Senator Matt Hanson, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll yield my time to Senator Lathrop.
Senator Lathrop, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Senator Hanson. I think I'm going to I've been going through the options. I want to detour a little bit and talk about one of the proposals that has come out of this process, which is establishing a requirement for indeterminate sentences. And that requirement would be that if you're the court and you're going to impose a sentence that's an indeterminate sentence, that the lower number is going to be half of the higher number, unless you are a sex offender, in which case it would be, I think, 85% of the higher number. That proposal is directly responsive to the consensus item of reducing jam outs. Because, if you can imagine, if you are getting a sentence and the top number is 8 years and the judge gives you 8 to 8 or 7 to 8, that individual is not likely to parole out. They're going to decline an opportunity to go through programming in all probability. They're going to end up jamming out. If that person has a sentence of 4 to 8, they now have a pretty significant incentive to go through the programming. And when we talk about programming, and for those of you that aren't familiar with programming, when you come into the department, you come in by way, if you're a man, you come in by way of the Diagnostic and Evaluation Center. It's on the campus next to the Lancaster County Correction Center. And while you're there, and the purpose of having you go through what we generally refer to as the D&E Center, the point in having you go through D&E is to do an assessment. They go through your assessments, and then you have sort of the list of things you need to do before you get out of there or before you're parole eligible. So if you are somebody that's had all kinds of problems with drugs, they're going to say you need inpatient drug rehabilitation or substance abuse. That's going to have to be done before you're eligible for parole, because parole isn't going to parole somebody who has a clinical programming need. That can be true with sex offenders if they have an inpatient sex offender requirement. By the way, not an easy thing to get into. A lot of people end up waiting to get into that program past their parole eligibility date, but that's an example. We have anger management, and there's, I think, 4 or 5 of them that are sort of what we generally categorize as clinical programming requirements. You'll know what you need to do before you leave, right? Or before you're eligible for parole, after you've been at D&E and they've done these assessments. Then you go into the population. Most of these people are getting programming. So if you require inpatient substance abuse or whatever the requirements are, you're going to get it shortly before you become parole eligible. I'm not sure I agree with that. We've moved a bill to have a study done to determine when's the appropriate time to get that. Seems to me it makes more sense to have somebody go through that earlier. and practice what they've learned and give an opportunity to see if it's stuck. But that programming is really important. That's really, really an important part of rehabilitation. We don't have a lot of what I would call vocational services. We're not going to train somebody over at the Department of Corrections to be a welder.
1 minute.
Right? Maybe when that individual gets to community corrections, he can go to a community college and study that, or be involved in that kind of a course or a process. But we don't, and that may have been something that we've done historically, but it's not something we have the ability to do now. Unless, of course, you're learning something if you're working in the sewing shop or in where they make signs and license plates. You might be learning a skill there. You might be learning a skill over at woodworking where they make desks and things for the state. But generally, it is those clinical programs that need to be completed before you're a candidate or will ever be a successful candidate. But the parole board's going to check those things. Is the programming complete? Does he have any misconducts? Has he been on parole before? Those considerations that we talked about before. And that window of
Senator.
time. Did you say time?
Yes, that was time. Thank you, Senator Lathrop and Senator Matt Hansen. Senator Morfeld, you are recognized. This is your third opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I want to pick up where I left off just a few minutes ago. One of the things I want to discuss that we talked about a little bit earlier is community corrections. And one of the issues when I first came down to the body was looking at and working on some of our mental health supports and supports with folks that have developmental disabilities, things like that. And it really went back to the reduction in funding after we closed, I think what it was called the regional centers at that time. Maybe it was called something else. It was 10 or 15 years ago. But in any case, what happened was we closed down those centralized facilities, and then we said, hey, we're going to invest that money back into the community, particularly for folks who don't have enough money to be able to provide for these services themselves. And what actually happened was another recession came along, budget cuts had to be made, and a bunch of these community organizations that were created to fill the vacuum of these more centralized facilities never really actually got the adequate funding that they needed to be able to provide these services. So then what happened was you had a bunch of people who didn't have access to healthcare, didn't have the ability sometimes, even if they had resources, to find a qualified professional, because there wasn't funding out to keep those qualified professionals employed with enough clients in certain areas. And then you also had a little bit of a brain drain that was happening in rural parts of our states for various reasons. And so you had a perfect storm of not enough providers, not enough funding for the providers to have a good mix of clients that could both afford the care and or not afford the care. And then you had a bunch of folks that still needed the care, didn't have access to it, went deeper into the mental health and other types of issues that they were experiencing and facing. And sometimes they would self-medicate and then commit crimes. And then it used to be that there was enough capacity, enough room in our correction system at that point in time to be able to provide them services. And now we have them sleeping on cots, mattresses, pretty much anything that the Department of Corrections can find in extremely overcrowded conditions. We're having a hard time finding mental health practitioners that actually want to work in the correction system. We have a hard time finding mental health practitioners, quite frankly, that want to work in the private sector in Nebraska. It's a huge problem. And don't get me started with all the licensing problems and other hurdles that we haven't addressed over the years to actually help recruit some of these qualified practitioners, mainly due to some LGBT non-discrimination language and some other things. But We'll get into that maybe a little bit later. But now what we have is we have a system that is the most overcrowded system in the entire country. We have a system that does not have enough qualified mental health practitioners to be able to serve not only the population within the prison system, but also the population of folks that are out in our communities. And so what we have then are folks that cannot get the assistance that they need, and then they're left to their own devices, and they're left to oftentimes self-medicating with either legal or sometimes illegal drugs. And then they get caught, and then they get put in a system, and they come out worse than they went in. And then we wonder why we have a crime problem. And in fact, that crime problem has been decreasing over the last 10 years, and yet our population keeps increasing. And if that's not a sign that we need to take action, then quite frankly, colleagues, I don't know what is. So I hope we will take action on 920, not just the portions that we have agreed upon, but also the portions that have a substantive impact. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator. Senator Moorfeld. Seeing no one else in the queue, Senator Lathrop, be recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I appreciate those of you who have stayed here to participate and take in what we're sharing about corrections reform and the prospect of, or the folly of, building more space without having the reform precede that undertaking. I'm going to close on this, and then I will ask that the amendment be pulled, and I'll go to the next one, Mr. President, after I complete my remarks. We've spent a good deal of time talking about the jamming out and what that means, why it's important to not have jamming out, and that we will be looking when we get to 920 at policies that are targeted towards preventing jam outs. I want to be forthright about this too. The jamming out is not only because people have flat sentences. We do have some people who have had an opportunity to go to some of these clinical programs and have failed. If your clinical programming is substance abuse and you're not ready to stop and you flunk out of the program, back to general population you go, and that's not going to get you parole, and you may well jam out because of that as well. This having a narrow or a flat sentence is a subset of a larger group of people who do not jam out or who do not parole out. Some of these folks parole out later than they should, and that's another piece, that we do have some inmates who are willing to go through programming but can't get to it. They maybe can't get to it because they're on a waiting list and other people are ahead of them. It may be that they're in one facility and it's not offered until they're transferred to a different facility. So that's also a problem with some people who are not paroled when they are otherwise eligible because they have not completed their programming. One of the other consensus items is the expansion of problem-solving courts. I started to talk about this sooner. Problem-solving courts are, colleagues, a great success. The Appropriations Committee and the Judiciary Committee have fully embraced this notion of problem-solving courts. The idea that an inmate would, or an offender would have an opportunity to enroll in a problem-solving courts and think of it as very intensive probation, where you have to appear before a judge who could throw you in prison and sentence you. And that creates quite an incentive. But something else happens in problem-solving courts. And this is important to talk about. A lot of these people that end up with felony convictions, whether it's substance abuse that's at the bottom of it or exactly what might be their demon that leads them to their felony conviction, a lot of these people have experienced trauma. They grew up in situations that aren't healthy, and they get in front of a problem-solving court, and it is very affirming. It is very positive, And for many of these people, for the first time in their lives, someone's telling them, attaboy, well done. In fact, they give them stuff sometimes when they'll give them a pass to go have dinner. They'll do things for them to encourage them, to support them. It is remarkably, I've been at a graduation before. There are remarkable things when these people graduate because for the first time
1
they're
minute.
being recognized by authorities, being recognized by people in authority and in power that they're a good person, that they're not as bad as the worst thing they've ever done. Very, very positive. They have a great success rate. The people get involved in criminal activity at a far, far, far lesser rate than if they are incarcerated in due time. So these problem-solving courts are an important piece of the puzzle. The challenge for Nebraska is judicial resources. The problem-solving courts have support staff, they have caseworkers, but ultimately the judge has to carve time, he or she has to carve time out of their day to do problem-solving courts, and that's an extra duty. Our challenge in expanding problem-solving courts is a judicial resource one. So as much as we can ask and hope and beg to expand problem-solving
That's time,
courts.
Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Latham. And
I do want to pull FA 75, and I'll go on to the next amendment.
FA 75 is withdrawn. Mr. Clerk for items.
Thank you, Mr. President. Amendments to be printed Senator Kavanaugh to LB 939, as well as a communication from the governor, Gross Legislative Bill 767, 767A, and 1099E were received in my office March 11th, 2022. These bills were signed and delivered to the Secretary of State on March 16th, 2022. Signed sincerely, Pete Ricketts, Governor. That's all I have this time, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Mr. Clerk for an amendment.
Next amendment, Mr. President, is from Senator Lathrop, Floor Amendment 76.
Senator Lathrop, you are recognized to open on FA 76.
Thank you. Just a couple more thoughts on problem-solving courts. Senator Geist passed a bill, I think a year ago, maybe two, that provides for a pilot program for mental health problem-solving courts, which is a bit of an experiment. I think it's in Sarpy in Lancaster County, if I'm not mistaken. I hope those are successful. This is a significant issue, as you've heard me speak on the mental illness and the people that have mental illness and the challenges they face with criminal activity. We are attempting to solve the expansion of problem-solving courts, but constrained by judicial resources. Option number 9 in the CJI report is to improve reentry practices for those being released from prison. If you are being released from prison, you are going to face many, many hurdles. There are many barriers to successfully leaving the department and getting into society, readjusting. A lot of it is a function of how much family support you have, how you were doing before you got in there. But a consensus item developed, and it's number 9 on the list, is that we do the following 3 things. Require the parole reentry process to assess for and establish a plan to address an individual's responsivity factors. And when I saw that on the list, I wasn't sure what that meant. That really means look not just at their risk to reoffend, but look at the challenges they face with employment, treatment, childcare, transportation, medical care, and education. Those things oftentimes are, as we try to assess their risk to reoffend, overlooked. The recommendation is that parole now take into account those responsivity factors. The second thing is establish a parole supervision position similar to the post-release supervision navigators. And third, require the department to track Medicaid enrollment forms filled out prior to release for all individuals leaving the department. Let me talk about that one. If you go into the Department of Corrections on a sentence, you are going to have your Medicaid eligibility stop, right? Medicaid won't pay for care for an individual who is incarcerated. This is about, and Senator Kavanaugh has a separate bill that we're trying to do some work on in the Judiciary Committee. This is about people being enrolled in a timely manner before their release. And why is that important? Many of these people have medical needs. A lot of them have needs for substance abuse or other types of treatment, much of it mental health as well. And having them enrolled in Medicaid at the time they are discharged is important so that when the parole officer says, I need you to get this treatment and that treatment, you need to see a counselor, you need to get outpatient substance abuse treatment, there is no delay because they're waiting for the process of getting that former inmate enrolled in Medicaid. It is a thoughtful consensus item, and it's part of the option number 9. Number 10 is to remove the barriers of criminal conviction for individuals who are successful on supervision. This is about giving information. This too is a consensus item. And I'm just going to stop here in case you've forgotten that the consensus items for the most part don't move that dashed line you saw. These are good things. They help people to be successful. They may move that line marginally or nominally, but they're not the ones that help us with the overcrowding situation as much as the non-consensus items that we'll talk about. At the successful completion of probation, specific notice should be given to the individual that they may be eligible to have their convictions set aside pursuant to 29-2264. What the outcomes of having their conviction set aside are and are not, and that they should contact an attorney or their public defender's office for further information. So if you successfully complete probation, you're entitled to have that conviction set aside. It's not as though you haven't been convicted, but it is set aside, and that too will be on your record, and it aids these individuals in getting employment. They can tell a prospective employer, yes, I was convicted, but that conviction has been set aside. This is current law, but it is clear that this opportunity to have your conviction set aside upon successful completion of probation has not been utilized to the fullest extent. Option 11 is also a consensus item, and this is to provide some incentives to motivate compliance while on community supervision. And when we talk about incentives, I think the fiscal note has about $38,000. So we're not talking about giving these guys big checks or anything, but it's more like positive reinforcement. And this was a discussion that happened in a working group that I did not participate in, but it makes perfect sense. You will have better success with people who are on supervision if you're not just threatening them with sanctions, but you are rewarding them like they do over in the problem-solving courts by giving them something like a gift card to, a Panera or something like that. Small things that say, good job. This is a consensus item, something that I think deserves some attention, some consideration. And again, that's a non-consensus item. Number 12 in our list of options is prioritize restitution to victims of crime. So when an individual does have the ability to pay something after they've been sentenced. So let's say somebody breaks into a house, steals something, a car, and crashes the car, the victim's entitled to restitution and the court's entitled to court costs. This particular consensus item came out of the work group that included victims of crime. They were interested in seeing that restitution be prioritized over court costs and the like. A simple, straightforward, thoughtful, responsive to victims doesn't really move that dashed line that is our growth rate, but nonetheless a thoughtful idea. Number 13 relates to providing incentive to mental health workers who want to help and treat and be involved in the care of individuals in the community. And I have to tell you, colleagues, when we look, and this is true in the child welfare, in the juvenile justice, and in the adult population, that we simply don't have across the state the mental health workers that we require. These individuals who are paroled leave the Department of Corrections, and they may have some requirement that they participate in counseling. They may need mental health treatment. They may need substance abuse treatment. And particularly out in western parts of the state, getting access to this type of care is sometimes very difficult because of the workforce. This option, which is a consensus item, would have a program set up to provide financial incentive to people, psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health professionals to provide, to go into that field and provide care in the community to the population that we're talking about here today. That's item 13. Number 14.
1 minute.
Thank you. Number 14 is to utilize county court and district courts as a physical access center for virtual behavioral health treatment for individuals on community supervision. Again, this is a consensus item. It is an attempt to provide mental health services where they are not available. Set up a station in a county court or a district court jury room somewhere that it's private, where an individual can go and meet face-to-face virtually with a mental health professional. This is a consensus item. It's thoughtful. It helps people get access to mental health care. And as much as I'd like to see us do this, it will not move that trajectory of our population, but it remains an important piece in the overall process
Senator.
coming out of CJI. How much more time do I have?
Time, Senator.
Thank you.
Finished with the opening. We'll open the floor to debate. Senator DeBoer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll end this day, colleagues, as I began, by asking for a plan. Senator Lathrop worked with a group that has proven to have success in other states on issues like ours. It was a process that involved all three branches of our government, and the group came up with some recommendations. Not everyone agreed on every recommendation. I can acknowledge that. But the recommendations that were consensus items won't get the job done, not alone. The entirety of the recommendations, the consensus and non-consensus items, is a full plan. It's a plan that has a good chance to get our average daily prison population below our capacity without having to build 200 beds every year and keep it there. It's a plan that focuses on public safety by putting guardrails into our criminal justice system, by reducing jam-outs and promoting post-release work in the form of parole and supports for parole. This is a plan that incentivizes people to participate in their own rehabilitation. We have to get people invested in their own change. And then, if as part of the plan we need to change conditions for the current population, we do that as part of a plan. If we are spending money, if we are dealing with taxpayers' dollars in the large amounts that we're talking about here, they deserve a plan to know what it is we're trying to do
They need to know that their money is going to be spent in a way that makes a difference. They need to know that their money is being spent in a way that promotes public safety and helps our community. They deserve a plan. We cannot keep taking little nibbles around the edges and kicking this problem down the road. I can't even imagine how frustrating it must be for Senator Lathrop, who has seen this problem over a 16-year period. In the past, we've done a lot of little things. We've approved a lot of partial plans. But we don't have time for little movements anymore. We need a full plan. And we shouldn't take partial action anymore and put another Band-Aid on. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the net effect of a prison that by the time it's built will still leave us in the same position where we are now, where we are still in the same overcrowded situation. The taxpayers deserve a plan. They need to know that their legislature has a plan for how we're going to get our average daily population below our capacity and keep it there. We have a plan.
1 minute.
With the CJI plan. So let's put everything together and come up with something that we can do in a full way for criminal justice in this state. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator DeBoer. Senator John Kavanaugh, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I didn't think I was going to get to talk this afternoon, but I'll take my chance. Well, I pressed my light when Senator Lathrop started talking about problem-solving courts. And so I think that is a topic that requires more conversation and revisiting. So the problem-solving courts, and he kind of did a nice job of describing a bunch of them, but to refresh your recollection, we have drug courts, which are designed for nonviolent offenders, a drug problem, which courts, which are designed for nonviolent offenders, a drug problem, which courts, which are designed for nonviolent offenders, a drug problem, which and that's one example. There's veterans courts, young adult court, mental health court being piloted. I think there's a DUI court being piloted in either Lancaster or Sarpy County. And again, there is a constraints in terms of the number it takes a judge, basically takes a day off a judge's docket. And so we need to make sure we have the judicial resources for this. But what happens is somebody gets charged with a crime. Usually it's a first offense felony. And then they go into court and they enter a plea to that offense. And then they apply to the court and hopefully get accepted. And then if they go through all of those programs and are successful over usually about a year or more, then they get to withdraw their plea and have the charge dismissed, so they don't have the conviction. And they come into court every, I think for drug court, it's on Tuesdays in Douglas County, and they report in front of the judge. They give a status update. If they screwed up, they can get sanctioned, meaning they can go spend the night in county or something like that. They can get other sanctions of other projects or programs they're supposed to undertake. And so it's got accountability. It's got, as Senator Lathrop said, they do get applauded for successes. And so it's got both of those things. And then the long-term outcome is that they get to, well, they get to have the progress that they make in the community, but then they also get to, if they're successful, withdraw that plea and not have the conviction. So it is a good program. I think we all get invited or have been invited to witness some of these graduations. The Veterans Court here in Lancaster County, I think recently invited me, at least. I don't know if they invite everybody. And it's certainly a great program to participate, to go observe. But the problem we have with some of these is that they're not necessarily available to everybody. There are individuals that get denied for different levels of offenses or get denied because of prior record. And some of these people didn't get into the program before these didn't exist when people came through. So that's a consideration. The problem with the problem solving courts is they're just not available enough. It's a resource allocation question. It's an admission question. And sometimes defense attorneys have to struggle and argue for the why their client should be admitted into whichever program, young adult court, drug court, but at whichever problem solving court, make sure that to get them in there and be eligible. And they have a demonstrated track record of success, and they are one tool that we can use, and we should certainly be building them up. But again, like all of these tools, like all the recommendations, there's no silver bullet, not one thing is going to solve all this, but expanding the access to this, expanding the use of this is something that will help us make progress. I don't know, are we going to go past me? I can end if everybody wants to leave. But
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so problem solving courts, certainly we should expand use of those. And without going on to another topic, I will yield the remainder of my time to the chair. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator John Kavanaugh. Senator McKinney, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of FA 76. And I was sitting here thinking again, I was like, we got people that want to be tough on crime, but we also have people that stand up and say we need property tax relief and we should respect the taxpayers. And if that is so, then you should be okay with being smart on criminal justice reform. I have a couple business degrees, and I would probably say that, the return on investment on being tough on crime is probably not the greatest. It's probably a failure. And if it was a Fortune 500 company, it would probably be bankrupt by now because it just hasn't worked. Being tough on crime has done what? We have an overcrowding crisis. Tough on crime did that. The governor wants to spend $270 million, and that's not even operational cost. That's being tough on crime. I don't think that has worked, so the return on investment is horrible again. If somebody could explain the fiscal thinking behind being tough on crime and how it's a benefit to Nebraskans and taxpayers, I'll be willing to listen to it. But to stand up and say we need property tax relief and saying we need to be tough on crime makes no sense. We could, help out our taxpayers if we didn't have proposals to increase felonies, build a prison, take people DNA, allow OPD to track juveniles that got ankle monitors, all those type of things. Tough on crime approach, but the return on investment has done what? Our prisons are overcrowded. The governor wants to build another prison. We have the 10th highest Black incarceration rate in the nation. I guess that's acceptable as well for the state because you guys want to be tough on crime. So just stand up and say, I'm okay for our state having the 10th highest Black incarceration rate in the nation. Please say it. And we've been going all day, and I've only spoken to one person that said he would like a prison in his district, but that's across the state. That's not between Omaha and Lincoln. And another that's open to it for economic development, which I just don't think prison should be used as an economic development tool. But when you stand up and say you want property tax relief, but you also want to be tough on crime, please explain that to your constituents, why we can't give them more property tax relief because the budget for the Department of Corrections is $200+ million. We want to spend $270+ million, not accounting for operational costs, supply chain being messed up, a war in Europe, all those things. Please explain why they cannot get property tax relief because you guys want to be tough on crime. It's not fiscally responsible to be tough on crime. It makes no sense. Please explain to me the fiscal rationale behind being tough on crime and why it makes sense to have overcrowded prisons, a proposal for a new prison, saying no to everything placed on the table to reduce the population. If you can make fiscal sense, I'll listen to you, but I'm sure nobody will stand up and make that argument because you cannot make the argument. And I don't know how you explain it to your constituents. Go in and say, oh, you want property tax relief? No, we didn't get it this year because we decided to vote for a prison.
1 minute.
So there's your tax relief in the prison, somewhere between, I don't know where, because only one or maybe two people in this body have stood up and said they actually want a prison in their district. So if there's only one or two people, where's this prison going to go? Is it going to go to Bellevue? I definitely don't want it in North Omaha. Fremont doesn't want it. Where are we going to put this prison? Seward doesn't want it. I don't know, but we really need to think about it. From a fiscal perspective, is being tough on crime fiscally responsible to taxpayers in Nebraska? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator McKinney. Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, Senator Lathrop, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President, colleagues. It's been a long day. It's been a long day, and we're going to break here apparently at 5:15. And I thought I'd spend a little time at the end of this day, sort of interrupt my going through the options that came out of CJI and talk about a couple of things that we started the day with. And sort of the motivation I have relative to this issue. You know, one of the things that has provided me the most satisfaction as a state senator over 12 years is the opportunity to come down to this body, come down to the Capitol, and identify some of the biggest issues facing the state. And I have been involved with and collaborated with senators, with interest groups, with others, to help resolve some of the biggest issues facing the state at different times. And I kind of like being involved in those. It's very gratifying to get something done when it is a significant issue facing the state. And this overcrowding is one such issue. I want you to think about it this way. This idea of criminal justice reform is something being advanced in conservative states by conservative senators. Senator McKinney mentioned that the Trump administration passed the first, I forget the name of it, the criminal justice reform at a national level. This is something that's happening because conservatives see that it doesn't make sense to continue to pour money into the Department of Corrections without pausing, without taking a pause, stepping back and saying, can we get more bang for our buck, more bang for our taxpayer dollar by another approach? By another approach. This is that moment where we need to pause and answer that question. We need to ask that question, and we need to be thoughtful. We should be leaders on this topic. The idea that we can come in here and jack up penalties and think that we're going to make a community safer is folly. It doesn't happen. Many studies have been done that demonstrate what makes a community safer, what discourages a criminal isn't the length of the sentence they may get, but the risk that they'll get caught. That's a law enforcement issue. If law enforcement, and by the way, they're doing a much better job in Omaha. I don't know if you read that article on gun violence in Omaha done by Henry Cortez in the World Herald a few weeks ago, you can see that their ability to solve those gun violence cases has gone up dramatically over the last 10 years. Dramatically. They attribute that, as they should, to the efforts of law enforcement in Omaha, but also the Crime Stoppers. And they are solving far more of these homicides and first-degree assaults than they ever did. But back to criminal justice reform. If we don't do this, we need 3 of the prisons the governor's proposing. We need 3 of them. We need to decide this isn't let's build a prison because the pen is past its useful life.
1 minute.
This is what do we need to build? And before we undertake that, an answer to that question, we need to know what our population projection looks like. And colleagues, if you don't want to do anything on this, if you just want to do a couple of consensus items and feel like we've done something, we're going to need a lot more prison than what the governor's proposing. We're going to spend a lot more on it. And you ought to think about this too, if you will, as you consider this tonight, that when you build a prison, your operating expenses, your ongoing operating expenses are probably going to be in the neighborhood of 10% of the cost to build the place. So you want to spend $200 million a year or $200 million to build something, you're probably going to spend 20 operating it every year. These operating expenses are going to eat us alive. And at some point, it's going to be the tax break
Time,
you
Senator.
don't get.
Time, Senator.
Thank you.
Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I spoke with Senator McKinney, and I think we have identified a space to build a new prison. It's between Lincoln and Omaha. It's close to a workforce, and they have a lot of land. I'm talking about Elkhorn. They came in, and a lot of people from Elkhorn came and testified during the interim about the ability to build large sports venues. So they clearly have the land. They've got a lot of people. People are moving out of Omaha Central out to Elkhorn. So Senator McKinney, there's your answer. And with that, if I have any time left, Senator Lathrop, would you like the rest of my time? I'll yield my time to Senator Lathrop.
Senator Lathrop, you yielded 4 minutes and 10 seconds.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Senator Cavanaugh. I started this, I started this journey a long time ago when I was here the first time, and I served on the Judiciary Committee, and Senator Ashford was the chair of that committee. And I can remember Brad and I would have Bob Houston in, who was then the director of the Department of Corrections. And I can remember Brad asking him, that population, it looks like it's getting up around 150%. Everything's fine. We're fine. We weren't fine. We found out when we did this special investigative committee that they were in a panic over at the Department of Corrections with the overcrowding and the circumstances. And the solution then was to go to no-cost options. And we know how that ended, and it wasn't well. Every once in a while, a legislature is faced with having to solve a problem facing the state. We have such a problem, colleagues. We have a problem with overcrowding, and it's not going to be solved by building more capacity. What we need to replace the pen with should be guided by a facility study, and that facility study should have the benefit of our policy that will influence whether our population grows at the department or stays flat. I am not on some mission to reduce the population. I'd be happy if we could just flatten the line or significantly decrease the rate at which our population grows. And it's not because I'm soft on crime or that I got somebody over there I want to see get released. I don't. But it's important because it's a problem facing the state, and there is a smarter way. And we have spent 9 months through the summer while you were playing golf. We spent 9 months trying to formulate what is the problem and what are the solutions. We have a path forward. We have a path forward that will flatten the trajectory of our rate of growth at the Department of Corrections. Eventually, we'll get to that bill. I appreciate your paying attention today. I appreciate your questions if you have any. I see Senator Urban looking at me, and I can't tell if he's looking at me like he wants to jump up and ask a question or not. But I invite you to ask questions because this may be something that's going to be a
1
little
minute.
uncomfortable to do. Did you say time?
1 minute.
Thank you. It may be something that's a little uncomfortable, and it may require that you tell your constituents why it makes perfect sense. But this is our turn. We can't kick the can down the road. And we certainly can't pass a couple of feel-good things out of 920 and think we've solved the problem. Or worse yet, build a facility that isn't gonna make a lick of difference. It will not make a lick of difference when it comes to overcrowding. We will remain an overcrowding emergency when this facility that's been proposed is built. And we will spend $270 million increasing our capacity by 700 beds. I have good news and bad news. The good news is it's after 5:15. The bad news is that tomorrow's going to look a lot like today. Thank you.
Items for the clerk, items for the record.
Thank you, Mr. President. Amendments to be printed, Senator Arch to LB 1012. Announcement, the Natural Resources Committee will hold an executive session tomorrow at 10 a.m. under the South Balcony. Natural Resources, 10 a.m. under the South Balcony. Finally, Mr. President, a priority motion. Senator Bosman would move to adjourn the body until Thursday, March 17th at 9:00 a.m.
Colleagues, there's been a motion on the floor to adjourn the body till 9 a.m. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. We are adjourned.